everybody. Just before we start, I just invite Gannon Ormsby here just to karakia the meeting. Thank you, Gannon.
Kia ora koutou katoa, nau mahara mai, I konei, kua hui mai koutou, I rau te tūnua konei tēnei whare, tēnā koutou katoa, just to acknowledge everyone here in the room. Before I do the karakia though, I just really want to introduce myself, so everyone knows who I am, and the significance of this karakia that I'm going to do to help us along the way. So my name is Gannon Ormsby, and I work for the Maniapoto Māori Trust Board. The karakia I'm going to do today was done for a tūkona, an ancestor called Tāwhiao. Now, Tāwhiao was the second Māori king, and he went to his whanaunga in Maniapoto, and his name was Rangawhenua. Now, the importance of Tāwhiao for these proceedings is that he did a lament which set the foundation for the vision and strategy for the Waikato River settlement. So that lament, Tōku Awa Koiora, basically sets the scene in regards to what he was trying to achieve post confiscation of the Waikato lands and the rivers and so on. And he was trying to seek redress with Queen Victoria at the time. So he was going to his cousin, Rangawhenua, to ask him to give him a karakia to help him on his journey from here over to England. So he went to go and see his cousin in Maniapoto, and my whānau connections on my father's side on Waikato and on Maniapoto. And my ancestor, Hamuera, looked after Tāwhiao when he was exiled in Maniapoto, at a place called Pukewhārangi, which is just south of Tikueta, and this is where he composed the lament for the vision and strategy. But anyway, he went to his cousin Rangawhenua, and he said, look, can you do a karakia for me to help me get across over to England and get me back safely again? So we're just about to embark on a journey today, and so this is the reason why I'm doing this particular karakia, and it goes like this. Kia hora te marino, may the calm be widespread. Kia whakapapapau namu te moana, may the ocean glisten like the greenstone. Kia tere tere te ka rohi rohi. May a glimmer of light always dance across your path. Ko tōho haere ko te rangi Māori, and may your travelling companion be peace. Tūturu whakawhiti whakamaua kia tīna, tīna haungia huie pai hie. So that's just bringing it all together. So this is our karakia for today. We're on a journey together to get us to the destination and back again safely. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora. I particularly like the metaphor of smooth sailing. I've got a suspicion that might be a metaphor that might be a little bit out of place at this point in time, but hopefully by the time we get to the end of the proceedings here, it'll be the one that we all agree to. My name's David Hill. Sorry, let me stand up. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. My name's David Hill, and with me Stuart Shepherd. Two of us have been engaged by I suppose it's council, isn't it, WRC, to facilitate not just today but also the expert conferencing that will take place following today and presumably up to the hearing which I understand is going to start in, I think it's March now, isn't it? Yeah, March. Just a few, Stuart, do you want to say you want to introduce yourself? No? Okay. Right. We won't introduce ourselves. We've introduced ourselves. That's fine. We'll just get on with business. Just a few matters which I'd like to touch on just before we start. First of all, for those of you, any of those people here who haven't registered, would you mind registering with Steve at the morning break so that we've got a full record of participants? We've had a conversation this morning as to whether or not this forum, which is an interesting word, isn't it? It seems like it's come back into vogue. The last forum I attended, I think, was back in 1980, but yeah, it's an interesting concept. We had a discussion this morning about whether or not this should be recorded so that other parties have the benefit of it. And there have been mixed views shared on that. I think our preference is that today should be recorded so that there is an audio record if anybody wishes to refer to it. That may have the unanticipated consequence that people are a little bit more guarded. So I just wanted to check with you participants as to whether or not you're comfortable with that suggestion that we record proceedings. Does anybody really not have or feel that that it should not be recorded? Okay, that seems fairly widespread. So let's have that recorded. I'm not sure how that recording will be made available. Presumably it'll be on the Regional Council's website in due course, but we'll get that to you by the end of the day. Steve? Right. Okay. Well. Okay. So if anybody wants that subsequently, in the first instance, you should get hold of Steve. Let me just. Most of you will have met Steve Rice when you came in. Oh, I thought he was about to disappear out of a door that we didn't know about. That's all right. Okay. So that's the issue of recording. During the presentation, yes.
Sorry, Commissioner. Could we just confirm that the recording will be available for public so we can express yourselves?
That's the intention.
Yeah.
That's
it's available for public.
yes, not limited to participants. Yeah, that's the expectation. So everybody's on notice, if you like, that there will be a recording made. If subsequently, and let me just note this, if subsequently anyone who's minded to listen to that recording thinks that they were unfairly recorded or perhaps a bit unguarded in terms of what they said, I guess there is the ability to issue a retraction or some sort of correction to that. Since it's not, I mean, this per se is not a formal part of the hearing, obviously, on Plan Change 1, but it is obviously under the auspices of Plan Change 1. So, yes, if you have some issues with respect to that, again, get hold of Steve subsequently. Let me see, where do I go now? Just outline what is this forum? It is really an opportunity to further understand two things, really, isn't it? It's the economic model that is in front of us, and also the key science inputs to that model. Really important that we all accept that this is not a debate on policy, right? So the policy debate is not part and parcel of this particular forum, and or part of the expert conferencing that will happen from that. That is, whilst it's sometimes difficult to make a divorce, obviously, between the modelling and the science and the policy, as much as possible, this is intended to be focused, if you like, on the model and on the science. What we hope to get through the course of today, and certainly by the course of tomorrow, are the key questions and topics that the expert conferencing really needs to focus on. So we want to get I guess what we want to do is distinguish, and we'll do a little bit more of that tomorrow, to distinguish those matters that are really key to the issue and those that are not quite so key, so we can, if you like, put those to one side. Hopefully we can get some sort of sense of priority tomorrow. Also important to note, this isn't the final opportunity to obviously comment on that. What we're proposing, and we haven't sort of formulated that in detail yet. As you know, we're proposing that there be a two-day expert conference on the 10th and 11th of December. We understand that a number of experts can't make that for various reasons, and that's fine. We'll cover that off in a slightly different workaround. We're also looking then to have a perhaps a more definitive session, which will be a key one, probably at the end of January. We're looking at the dates, probably 30, 31 January, something in that order. And we're proposing, just to let you know now, and we'll talk with the experts about it more tomorrow. We're proposing that parties who want to be involved in those expert forums actually produce may say or will say statements prior to the 10th of December, so that, if you like, positions and issues are more clearly defined, so that we can actually move forward on that. We'll talk about that a bit later on. So what this forum is not, I think, and you tell me whether you agree or not, it's not an opportunity to debate the policy framework, nor is it an opportunity for a detailed debate on the economics and the science. That's not the role of today. Today's more of an explanatory process, certainly with questions, and the panel will respond to the questions, both the 16 sets of questions that we've already been given, and also we'll open to the floor, obviously, as well for that. But it isn't really a debate at this point. Other than that, I think if there are any issues, let Steve know, or grab either Stuart or I in the breaks, or bring it to our attention if you want to do that. Ground rules are quite simple. Standard rules apply. Just listen, contribute, and learn, and give us your input. I mean, I'm hoping that we take the karakia seriously, and that we're respectful, and that it is a reasonably tranquil day, even though I know it's a very emotional issue for a lot of people. We'd enjoin you to be reasonably steadfast in terms of being respectful. And we'll try and moderate that. Anything else? Just any questions from anybody about how we will proceed? We'll be, I think the next item on the agenda will be the presentations, but let me just check what we told you was going to happen first of all. Yeah, I think that's probably... So does anybody have any questions about today and tomorrow? Yes, thank you.
David, if there are questions which the experts don't have the answers to, fingertips,
Yep.
is there a mechanism for them to
Yes, and thank you for that. There will be questions that are beyond the range, well, not necessarily beyond the range, but beyond the willingness of the panel to respond to. We do have a representative from council here. We will be referring those questions through Mr. Would you like to stand up, Rob? Thank you, so that everybody can see who you are, just so that you can get inundated with questions. Right. So those questions which we can put through, but of course the other part of the answer on that one is that those questions in turn will identify an issue that the experts may need to be caucusing on. So we'll take that forward to tomorrow's group as well. So it'll go two ways. How and whether those questions get formally answered, I guess, is a matter for council rather than for me. Rob, have you had an opportunity to think about how that might happen if there are questions that come forward? No. Okay. All right. We'll get an answer as to how that might work by the end of the day. Thank you. Anything else? All right, well, sit back, relax, enjoy the day, and I'll invite... Steve, did you have any housekeeping that you... Does anybody... Who's our health and safety person? I'm sure somebody has to do health and safety. Righto, Steve, you better do some health and safety, I suppose.
Evacuation is required. Turn right outside the door, close the car park, so that beyond the cars and the car park. Toilets down the corridor to the right, at the end on the right-hand side to the right.
Right. And I have a standing rule. In the event of an alarm, you wait till I get out of the room first. Thank you. Right. Okay. All right. Yes.
Will the screen go higher, please?
Will it or should it? Right. Well, we're about to see. This might be the first health and safety issue. Yeah, yes. Yes, feel free to move around. Don't feel that you're limited for two reasons. One, if you can't hear. Secondly, if you can't see. And if both of those apply, you probably shouldn't be here. So, right. Okay. So I'll ask our presenters to introduce themselves as they do their presentations. questions of clarification only as the presentations occur. We'll obviously take questions this afternoon. This afternoon's entirely a question and response session. But if you do have questions of clarification because something isn't entirely clear, by all means, stick your hand up and ask the question. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Will the slides be available after the session?
I think they're available now. Well, yes, the short answer is yes. How? Steve. Steve, if there are any questions, Steve is the answer. Doesn't matter what the question is. Right.
Marina koto, te whānau o te awa whakata. Good morning everyone, thank you for your interest in coming along. And I'm kind of, I always find mics and that a little bit restricting, but if you can people towards the back hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Oh, we've got a roving mic. Okay, that's good, thank you. So yeah, welcome, and as somebody who's been working on this project for quite a long while, it's great to see the interest from the people here. So thank you. It's also good to see so many familiar faces in the audience. To see Graham there, I haven't chatted to for a long time. Gavin, welcome. So in the next little while, there'll be a presentations from myself, Sandy and Graham. And on the way through, I think we agreed that on the way through, if there's points of clarification, we just raise your hand and we'll try and deal with it on the spot. If there are points of clarification, you're getting a little bit lost or don't understand what's being said. If there's a lot of questions, clearly we haven't done a good job in explaining what we're doing, and we might have to roll back a little bit on that. But let's see how we go, and we're happy to take those questions along the way. And I will give just a scene-setting presentation. Sandy will talk about the water quality modelling that he did and how that fed into the work that Graham did on the scenario modelling. And I hesitate to call it economic modelling because that's only part of what that modelling is about. Okay? And we had difficulty in trying to know where to pitch the presentations. And that's because there's a lot of work gone into it and there's a lot of complicated stuff. So the presentations may not satisfy your curiosity. In fact, I'd be very, very surprised if they did. So your opportunity is in the Q&A session after lunch. So you've got a specific question, want to delve into the detail of some of the technical work, or another kind of question, we'll cater to that in the afternoon. So that's where we're going. So we've pitched our talks at a fairly high level in an introductory and explanatory way. I do apologise. I was imagining this huge screen and a tiered thing for everybody to be able to see properly. Firstly, the Healthy Rivers project structure, and it's important to understand the role of the technical input into the process. And you'll see a technical leaders group, of which I was a member of, and the technical experts. And basically, we were responding to, and this is perhaps somewhat different from previous plan process you may or may not have been involved in, but certainly different from my perspective. We were responding to and reporting to a collaborative stakeholder group, not the council. Okay? So that's important. And We were therefore independent, and we're independent of council, so an independent group of experts as a technical leaders group. There were 7 of us, and if I could just take a moment to acknowledge the passing of one of those people, John Quinn, a member of the technical leaders group who passed away last week, a friend of mine, and a friend of many, I'm sure. And he had a great love for the river and for all things in it. So it's been a tough week. As a group, as I said, we were responding to and reporting to the collaborative stakeholder group. And they used that input in their deliberations along with a whole lot of other input from their own stakeholders and so on. Just so you get an idea of the scale of the work that went in, a range of expert workshops held through the process, commission reports and peer review of those reports. In total, and I may have got the numbers not quite right, but I think there are 45 reports with 22 organisations involved in preparing those and 75 individual experts. And that was excluding the workshop participants. And of course, I've also forgotten there, why would I forget it today, the presentations that we gave and the Q&As that were held. And I would estimate probably 100 or more of those to different groups during the process. And you can see all of the reports on the Healthy Rivers site as well, for your interest. And there's a few key ones, if you really look down through that, and you'll see summary of, and they're always a good one to go to first, and gives you a picture of all the work, all the individual technical work that lies underneath. Now, in terms of the CSG deliberations and the kind of input that we were providing. Firstly, the CSG needed to take account of the vision and strategy for the river, and of course, as it just emerged at the start of that process, the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. And whilst that, you might think that's a policy thing, and it certainly is, it's also a technical thing. You've got to make sure that your technical advice is consistent with those policies. And for example, the vision and strategy, some of the key things in that, there should be no decline in water quality. Manage cumulative effects. Manage not only the river, but its tributaries. So all of those things influence how you go about your technical work and advice that you input into the CSG. We also did work around current state. What is the current state of the river and its tributaries? And we also provided technical inputs around the water quality of possible future states. So the CSG would be having a discussion and saying, well, someone might say, well, I want the river in Hamilton to be as clean as the river is at Ohakuri now. So what does that mean? So, those kind of questions. And the work, as already been alluded to, covered a whole spectrum, not just what we're talking about today, which is a very small subset. The modelling is an important component, but it's only a subset of the information that was provided and deliberated upon by the CSG. So there was social and cultural assessments done. There was work done engaging with iwi around Mataranga Māori, and there was what was called an integrated assessment done by, I think it was particularly led by Liz Wedderburn from Ag Research and Antoine Coffin. So, as I said, our brief for this forum is restricted to the modelling component. Now, just one summary slide summarises a whole lot of stuff, but it's just to show you an example of some of the work. For example, the CSG said, well, at some point in time, this river has to be at the quality expected in the vision and strategy, at some point in time. And that has things like swimmable and fishable, for example, in it, a healthy river. And so in terms of the water quality parameters that have been part of this plan change process, what does that mean like? Well, what does that look like? What does it mean? And so here's just an example for one site in the Waikato River of where it is now in the red and what a vision and strategy water quality would look like. And as you can see, an increase in clarity, a decrease in the nitrogen, phosphorus, algae, and E. coli levels at that site of that kind of order. Okay? And I won't go into the detail of all the science beneath that, but that's kind of like the long-term challenge that sits there. So going to the modelling context, as I've already talked about, got to take account of the vision and strategy requirements, and as I've already mentioned, in particular, tributaries, and no further decline and cumulative effects. So you've got to have a model that actually has the spatial resolution to look at tributaries, that has the spatial resolution to look at no decline in water quality in the tributaries as well as the main stem. And you've got to have a model that routes contaminants down through the system so that you can look at cumulative effects. So there's an example of taking account of the vision and strategy. The NPS came in at the start of the process, as I said before, and it has got an attributes table in the back of it. And that, by attributes, it means things like nitrogen concentration, phosphorus concentration, E. coli concentration. And it has it in different bands. So to achieve a certain outcome, you need to have a water quality better than this value and be in this band. And so that provided the framework for the modelling. Also in that is the statistics that it uses. Typically it uses median values, occasionally 95 percentile values to explain that water quality. And it's typically averages and often 5-year median over a 5-year period. So you need to be, you have a model that needs to be able to represent that and predict that into the future. The plan change was restricted to considering 4 contaminants: nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and E. coli. But the models have to deal with those 4 contaminants one way or another. And it also has to be able to deal with mitigations to that contaminant delivery into the rivers. Now, I'm talking about rivers all the time here, just to make it simple, but of course we've got lakes as well. Okay. Also have to be able to model approximately 1.1 or 1.2 million hectares of land, so it's quite large, but it has to be spatially resolved. And the reason it has to be spatially resolved is because it's a diverse landscape we're dealing with, as all of you folk will understand. You know, a catchment in the Waipa is very different characteristics to, say, a catchment in the Upper Waikato. So, diverse landscapes, therefore your model has to be able to resolve that diversity. And you need to be able to have a model that you can use. In other words, it's available. Somebody hasn't tied it up and you can't use it. And you need to have data to drive it. And some models can be very data hungry or input hungry, and we're just not going to have the data to drive them. Others are simple and at the other end, but maybe they're not spatially resolved. So somewhere in that spectrum, you have to choose a model. And choosing the model is a process around that. There are expert workshops held at the beginning of the process. And a whole range of things were discussed. I've just put a few up there. Their data needs, how data hungry they are, the outputs they produce, what they can deal with, and is it fit for purpose? Is it fit for the purpose that we're trying to use it for? Okay? And the models were chosen by that experts group just through having a good scientific, robust debate. And recognising, of course, that no model is perfect. All models are an approximation of the real world. We just need to understand what assumptions are being made, what approximations are happening when we use them. So take care when interpreting or using models. And then the process started for the various teams of gathering the relevant data, if it wasn't already in existence. If it was in existence, obtaining permission to use it, often from sectors that had that data and provided it. Thank you to all of those who did that. And then the models were constructed, tested, peer-reviewed, and the outputs of those models delivered to the CSG. And in particular, the CSG were asking us all kinds of questions because they're trying to predict the future. They're wanting to know if we do something, what will that do to the water quality and how much will it cost? And so that's the simulation mode, if you like, of the model. The other one is the optimization mode, where we want this certain water quality, tell us how we're going to achieve it, which is kind of the reverse question. Okay? And you know, I see a few CSG members in the audience here, so I won't embarrass them by what I'm about to say, but I really thought that the CSG took the modelling output and dealt with it in a sensible and rational way, in the sense of, look, this is one input to our deliberations. let's have a look at the comparison between different scenarios, and let's make some calls about next steps based upon that. So it was used more in a comparison sense, recognising the approximations that have gone into it. And recognising, of course, that modelling, as I said at the start, is only one input into their deliberations. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to Sandy to explain a bit more about the water quality modelling.
Just before you do that, Bryce, thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions, any quick questions for Bryce on that? We'll take more detailed questions later on, but any quick ones? All right, thank you. Sandy.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll have to see how this goes. Well, first of all, if I do need to drop the mic, because I'm holding various bits of paraphernalia, can people hear me at the back? Yeah, cool. Right, so I'll drop the mic. But Bryce said a really good scene there.
Just a second, Sandy. Can I just check with Stuart at the back? Can you record Sandy if he doesn't use the mic? That's one problem, I'm afraid,
All right,
Sandy.
I will
Sorry.
chuck that in front, and that's fine. Hopefully it'll pick it up from that point. So yeah, I was saying, well, I haven't been introduced yet. I'm Sandy Elliott. I'm from Niwa. I'm a catchment modeler. Have been in the game for quite a while, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be here. It's amazing to think that we've got 90-odd people turning up to a modelling meeting. I wouldn't have imagined that when I started out my career. So things have moved on, and our ability to check out what's going on is pretty amazing. So the slides, I've got to try and figure out which way this thing goes. So I'm going to focus on the catchment model, the biophysical models for some of those key contaminants that Bryce is talking about. So the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, E. coli, a microbial indicator, clarity, so water clarity, how far you can see in the water. Those are key things, and sediment is a component of the clarity. It wasn't just me doing this modelling, really. I lent on a number of great people, and Samadni Davies is one of the main helpers, Charlene Yolden, and you can read a name there, most of them from Niwa. But I should say that we also drew upon expertise outside of Niwa when it came to aspects such as where does the groundwater go. So there is a broader group. Are we okay? Not quite yet.
You're not starring, Sandy.
All right.
Just bring out the guitar.
Yeah, I know. It's a bit like that, isn't it? So, I want to give you a brief overview of how do the models work, what are the bits that are in it, because it can be quite confusing. Have you still got problems there? No, it's good. It can be quite confusing just how the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle fit together. I will be touching on what some of the limitations of this modelling, because Bryce mentioned all models have limitations, and associated with that is uncertainty. But, I started off with about 25 slides. That was my sort of short version. Bryce said, no, you've got to keep it to 10. So that has somewhat limited my ability to present all the results. But we do have a number of reports where you can read what was done in those projects. They were done 3 years ago, but we haven't changed the story since then. So what's in those reports is still relevant and appropriate if you want to get into questions like model performance. So this is one of the how the bits fit together. Some of you might not be able to see it. There's a pointer here which might help. So this is a model overall of what Graham will be addressing. So it addresses the water quality aspects, but also the cost and benefit, and how much does it cost to do things in a catchment. To get that to go together, we need these biophysical models. And so, well, what do we think the E. coli nutrients and sediment and clarity will look like if you've got a certain land use and if you've got certain mitigation measures in place? So I'm primarily addressing this part, and Graham will be looking at how it's all put together and the economic components as well. And the idea of this Waikato model is to have the biophysical model talking to the economic model. So ended up having quite a simple model that could be a part of the economic model. And if Graham says, the water quality is not looking too good and I want to put in some mitigations, we can tell him in an automated way what the resulting water quality will be. So that's the style of modelling that we're doing, and that set a bit of the flavour of how we went about it.
Sorry, Stephen, just a clarification. The arrows are indicative, or the arrows only go one way in that one?
Hold on, just let me explain there. So the solid arrows are going one way, so mitigations will be fed into the biophysical model. The biophysical model will say what the water quality is. But then these dashed lines on the right are more of a sort of vague indicative feedback cycle. So that would be happening based on the cost and the water quality, what mitigations might be put in place in a simulation mode or an optimization mode. Yeah. There's one more question there. Yeah.
What do the top two boxes say under integrated model?
Land use and mitigations. Yeah. Yeah, and if you can't see anything up, just pipe up. That's great. So the simplified models, we have a luxury here in the Waikato catchment is that there's been pretty good monitoring being done over quite a long period, 20 more years. And we felt we could draw on that, and there's quite a good spatial distribution of those sites across the catchment. So that set the tone for how we constructed the model. In fact, most of the spatial construct in that is based around the monitoring site locations. And we had set up sub-catchments, and this has been actually taken into the management, but we set up sub-catchments around those monitoring stations. And then we can tie the model into what's actually happening on the ground in a kind of a one-to-one way. Some places there isn't a monitoring station, but we thought it'd be good to have a model, say what's going on in the model. In fact, some new monitoring is underway in some of those places where we saw gaps. But most of so we broke the catchment up, that's the full Waikato catchment, excluding the Lake Taupo catchment, into 74 nodes and sub-catchments. That's the spatial construct, and they all feed into each other and are tied together. But I will come back to that a little bit later on. Simple models for annual average conditions, medians, values, those sorts of things, and Bryce has already mentioned those. We've got a load model. So you'll see later on we're talking about loads, that's tonnes per year that go down the stream, or number of microbes per year that go down the stream. Generally load models, but we want concentrations, to make decisions. So we took a kind of it's a bit of a shortcut, a modelling shortcut. I don't know if you know the climate science but we took a proportional approach to this. So that if the loads go up by 10%, then the concentrations will go up by 10%, based on the current measured concentrations. If there's no change in loads, then you won't get a change in the concentrations. So it's approximate, but it's not a bad starting place. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment models feed an algae model, which in turn feeds an optical clarity model, and I'll unpack that a little bit later on. We utilise expert knowledge and extensive monitoring data, so we're not just relying on coming up with mechanistic models that have no grounding. They're based on the data, but they're also, models we can't predict everything, and sometimes you have to draw on the experts to give you some guidance, and I'll show an example of that later on. And the models are constructed so that they can be incorporated into... Sorry, there was a question there. Yep.
How did you define load? Calculate load? What data did you use for this?
Well, can we come back to that later on, because the presentation does go into that. If it's still not clear, well, then we can get into it. So this is just kind of like an introductory slide. All right. So. Catchment calculations. So to give you an idea, some of you are not familiar with catchment calculations, but we have each of these sub-catchments on the left-hand side, 74 of them. Within each of those, we had the land use broken down into different types of land use. It depended on the particular model, but it might have, dairy support, sheep and beef, hill and intensive sheep and beef, forest, native forest and exotic forest, urban, so a number of different land uses within each of those sub-catchments. And add some point sources for each of those sub-catchments. We know what those are. And in some cases, a geothermal source added in there as well. And then, after we have those, based on those attributes of the sub-catchment, we figure out the loading coming from the sub-catchment, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail later on. But that's the generated load, but then we can apply mitigation beyond that. So if you're putting riparian buffers in, if you're putting various treatment measures that Graham will mention, that will reduce the loading coming from that sub-catchment. And then there's 74 of these. They're all sort of feeding into each other in a tree-like structure. This is the linear one, and the load is accumulating down the catchment. It's also potentially losing contaminants. That's the attenuation in the groundwater in streams and lakes. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail. So you get accumulated load and concentration at each of the nodes that you're interested in the catchment. You don't need to see the detail of this, but to know that behind this there is spatial detail in things like the land use on the left-hand side, all the different land use types and their spatial configurations. We have that information. We then know what the proportions of those land uses are in each sub-catchment. Similarly, I like this diagram on the right. It's the drainage class of the soils from the land resources inventory, some poorly drained soils, some well-drained soils, those sorts of things. So we have some information about the soil attributes. In this particular case, we use that for the E. coli model. If you have poor drainage, you tend to get more E. coli coming off. So we take some of these soil factors and rainfall and stuff into account as well. But it depends on the particular model, which you're trying to predict. Bryce said, don't show this slide. But this particular one has to, I purposefully put in something that's quite complicated to give you a feel for what we looked at in terms of groundwater attenuation. And I think maybe I didn't, I thought I had some keywords in there before, but nitrate in upper catchment is quite a big concern, and there's some technical questions there around whether what you see in the streams at the moment really reflects what's going into the top, the leaching that's going into the soil. What can happen is that there can be changes over time in those loadings because there's been development in the catchment, the leaching has been increasing over time, but because the groundwater takes a long time to get through the system, or can take a long time to get through the system, you haven't necessarily seen that change in concentration in the stream yet. It's waiting to come, it's a load to come. What that means is that even if you don't change any of those, the leaching rates in the catchment, there may still be some increases in nitrogen. And then what that means, you're kind of fighting a rearguard action to counter some of that load to come. And quantifying that load to come then becomes an important question. So we looked at that fairly carefully in the upper catchment as well as we could within the time frame of the work. And we got a bunch of expert opinion looking at various factors that might affect the load to come, and also how much of the nitrogen is lost in the groundwater. There can be removal, denitrification and so on in the groundwater that will actually remove some of the contaminant. So we looked at things like the groundwater age and whether the loads had been increasing over time, or whether it was base flow dominated, where the flow is just going straight into the stream or going through the groundwater. What's the trends in the catchment land use? Looked at some of the monitoring data, so that's on the right. Yeah, well, actually it was going up in that stream, and that concentration in the Puerto stream probably doesn't really reflect where we think it should get to. So that might be because of this load to come question, or it might be because of decay. So we had to think about those sorts of things for each of the upper sub-catchments. And we told a story about each of those sub-catchments. What else do we have here? Okay, that's just to finish this little thing, and then we'll come back to the question. There was, we come up with these bottom line numbers, which involved some expert opinion, and was also peer reviewed. So in this case, we expect overall moderate attenuation with considerable load to come. That means that we think, look, really, even though you're only seeing 60% loss, 40% loss, we think ultimately you should be seeing only 40% loss. It looks like you're losing 60% at the moment because of load to come. It might only be 40%. So let's finish that slide. And the question, yeah?
Thanks, Andy. Maybe it's going to come later. Did that take into account biological processes?
So that's when you look at that ultimate attenuation, 40%, that's the biological process part. But that's based on like maps of where anoxic zones are, for example, in the catchment, where there are some statistical models and associated maps to say we've got anoxic conditions in this subcatchment, therefore we expect quite a lot of attenuation.
No, my
Yeah.
question was
Yeah.
more along, was it taking account of what was occurring once it hit the stream or the river or the lake?
Yeah, so there's further biological processes in the river and the reservoirs and some of the shallower lakes, so we did take that into account. We had some other information from other types of models. Not a heck of a lot of attenuation in the main stem because it's moving through so quickly and there's not much time for much to happen. And there's cycling going on as well. In the hydro, yes, you do take a bit out. Hydro dams, you do take a bit out of nitrogen, phosphorus, a bit of sediment too. Yes.
Just one question, the attenuation in the bottom line there, that was taken account of at the subcatchment level?
Yes. Yeah, so it was assessed at the whole of the subcatchment scale. There's questions, but there's actually things going on a smaller scale within subcatchment, so that's a tricky part of the analysis. Yeah, we had to make some judgment at that point. Oh, so this is sort of summarises what happens. I think maybe this one isn't so important. It's just saying, it's stressing the load to come point. You've got a current concentration. You think it might go up at 0.55. It might actually go up to 0.67, even if you did nothing in the catchment. That becomes the bottom line and where it makes a difference. So the clarity component of the model. So I've been talking mostly about nutrients. The clarity component is probably the most complex part because there's different aspects that can affect clarity. The clarity, that's how far you can see in the water, is affected by algae. That's usually the green stuff that's in there and grows up, especially apparent down at the bottom of the main stem Waikato, and sediment. Obviously, the murkiness in that sense, and there can be some kind of background yellow substance as well. So multiple components contribute to the clarity, and so we need to be able to predict those different components. So there's a separate model for the sediment and how much sediment we think we should be having. There's a separate model for the algae, and then, where do we go? There's algae concentrations from it's fed by knowledge about the nutrients. Yep. Oh, I got the colour right at least, so I made a point of that. So you probably have to ask the optical kind of experts, and we had a guy called Rob Davies-Colley at NIWA. You can think of it as being tannins or perhaps some humic substances, often come out of peat soils, that sort of thing. So yeah, that gives you an idea.
Andy,
Oh.
Can you tell us a little bit about the nutrients that you were assuming were driving algal growth in the subcatchment?
I haven't a sort of breakdown, but I can tell you how we went about the calculations. Yeah. Sure. So that's actually, the algae one that's coming up very shortly. Okay, cool. So what I showed in the previous slide there is the simplest box diagram, but there's quite a lot of complication around that. One of them is how the nutrients affect the algae. The chlorophyll is a measure of the algae. And then those different components feed into the clarity calculation. So here's an interesting one. I guess this says it in a way. This map, or this diagram, probably needs a bit of explanation. In this case, it's for a particular site, Waikato Narrows, and where Charlene and others worked up a relationship between the total nitrogen in the water, the concentration, the total phosphorus, and how much chlorophyll. So this is a sliding scale, and if it's red, you've got lots of chlorophyll, and if it's blue, it's pretty good. And down here is where we are currently with the Waikato at the and there's some modelling behind, how do you get those colours? That's a detail I haven't got time to go in today. But here's where things are currently within the Waikato River, and associated with that is some sensitivity to total phosphorus or total nitrogen. If you go along this way, there's not actually that much sensitivity to nitrogen changes, according to this model. So that's an interesting thing, but there's a little bit of sensitivity. We didn't want to have it either nitrogen or, black and white, either phosphorus or nitrogen. There's a bit of both comes into it because different things happen at different times. Phosphorus is a bit more sensitive. In this case, because in the case things are starved a little bit for phosphorus at that stretch of the river. So yes, the text here is just about those relative sensitivities for the nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is sort of an empirical model and also bringing some of our knowledge of what's going on, but it's, it's uncertain. Those nutrient chlorophyll relationships is probably one of the weaker points of the modelling.
So what's the conclusion you would come to from that slide? Can you summarise it?
There's depends what the question is. We have some methods to relate total nitrogen and total phosphorus to algal concentrations or chlorophyll concentrations. That's one point. There's varying sensitivities to nitrogen, changes in nitrogen and phosphorus, depending on where you're sitting currently. So those probably be the two key points. In terms of what the implications of that are for land management, that's really what comes into this Graham's model and the CSG models. What does this actually mean back in real life and what you have to do? Yeah.
Is there another key sort of thing that you take from this graph in terms of the relative sensitivity between those two nutrients?
Yeah, there is relative sensitivity. So in this particular case, there's not much sensitivity to nitrogen, only 1% change in nitrogen for a 10% increase in, 1% change in chlorophyll for a 10%. Yeah. Oh, okay.
You stated earlier that the Waikato region's had monitoring going on for a number of years. Do you have this type of information from, say, 20 years ago? Comparative?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, this is one of the... Bryce alluded to a number of sort of sub-studies that have been done to provide background information and understanding of the catchment. Some of that was addressed in some of those sorts of questions. What's been going on in the past has been addressed in some of those other reports. But we did take notice of what they say. So there's things that you see in the main stem sites of the river. That nitrogen's been going up, phosphorus hasn't been going up much, and the chlorophyll has had its own trend. So we took that into account about what the relative sensitivities are to the nitrogen and the phosphorus, and that went into the equations that sit beside the knowledge that, gee, the nitrogen's been going up and the phosphorus has been going down, but the chlorophylls, I think, was going down as well. So depending on the site, are stable or going down. So that gives you a bit of information that actually there's less sensitivity to nitrogen now than there is to phosphorus. So that's part of the historical story, telling you a bit about what's going on. That's one thread of evidence, but there can be multiple lines of evidence. There's different aspects you can look at, but certainly that historical data does provide some guidance. Yeah.
Can I just ask a clarifying question on the slide? The R lines are ratios of E to P, is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it's on a mass basis. Yeah. But they're just for sort of guidance and interpretation, really. Yeah. I think this is the only one on model performance, just to let you know that, yes, we did look pretty carefully at how well the measured concentrations compared with the predicted ones. For nitrogen, it's a little bit of a funny story because we did adjust things to achieve a fairly good fit to get the attenuation right and that sort of thing on a site-by-site basis. So this is not quite, I'll come back to that. This is not quite a kosher plot is probably better than if you had no other information. But we thought it was important to build in existing information where we had it, so that's why we took that approach. But still there is some scattered. There's some sites that did strange things that were doing odd things, like Waitapu Waitapu at Campbell Road, and it had much more than we thought would be coming in, but we didn't want to invent a source from anywhere. It's probably a geothermal source, but not one that we knew about, so we just lived with the fact that we're under-predicting for that site. But remember as well that we always tie things back to the current measured concentrations. So again, it's that 10% increase at Waitapu will probably give us a 10% increase in concentration, or thereabouts. There's various other reasons, a bunch of detail around this about why some sites might be higher and lower and all that sort of thing. Gee, I wonder if I missed a slide, but I might have glossed over something. I wanted to say, just when I look at this, before I go back so we don't get distracted there, for the nitrogen model, because there was a question as well, and there's a question at the back, but where did these nitrogen loads come from? Because I don't know if it was there on the slides or not, but how much nitrogen you get per area of land use, that was provided by Graham Dool for the different land uses, well, through Graham Dool, and that involved industry partners coming up with their own assessment, dairy NZ, beef and lamb. It's how much did they think was coming off the different land uses and the different sub-catchments. They came to us through Graham Dool. So often we come up with our own assessment of that, but we wanted to use numbers that the industry felt comfortable with. In some cases, because we're taking those numbers, well, actually, that was providing a little much too little nitrogen in some cases, and you can't invent nitrogen from anywhere, so you end up with an under-prediction. That's the way it goes, but overall it wasn't too bad. We did that for nitrogen and phosphorus. E. coli, we had our own numbers derived from calibrating models. So I just wanted to make that point because it was raised a question, and there was a question at the back from the previous slide. Yeah.
Well, you said that these numbers don't actually fit, so you adjusted the model to suit. Well, I'm not very happy with that idea.
Right. That is part of the judgment that you take when you're doing modelling, and we've been sort of transparent about that. We're not making up numbers. The reason why we adjusted it is because there's actual measurements from some of these sites, and we see that, well, things not lining up that well. In fact, there's some uncertainty there, and we can adjust some of the factors to get a benefit. That's like some of the attenuation factors. You're just not seeing as much nitrogen in the stream as you get from the estimates of the leaching. They're going to have some attenuation along the way, within reasonable bounds. You don't do ridiculous things, and you still end up with some discrepancies, but you use that kind of monitoring data to say, yeah, well, we'll adjust the attenuation in that sub-catchment. How far you go with that is a bit of a judgment call, but it's documented.
Excuse me, did you include any flow data in terms of the in-stream loading?
We certainly do when it comes to what's the current measured loading coming down the stream. That's where you combine the flow rates and the concentrations. If you multiply those things, you get a loading rate basically, but you've got to add that up over time. Do you think the concentration is going to change, and does it change when the flows go up? All that sort of stuff goes in behind the estimate of the measured load. So if you take into account that sense, some in terms of how much attenuation you get in the reservoirs, the flows can affect that. So those really the two key places we might have used that flow information. Yeah.
Just on that point, it's quite noticeable on some of those sites that are tested that there's an extreme variation in the E. coli, the nitrogen and the phosphorus.
Yep.
Now, this would be related, presumably, to the amount of rainfall that has been in the catchment over a quiet period.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So that's built into the calculation that you're talking about now.
Well,
You can calculate the load.
to calculate the measured load, yes, you take that into account. But the model stuff is more kind of averaging things out over time. It's looking at the annual loads going down the stream. It's looking at the average concentrations in the stream, because that's what people were interested in. They weren't really interested in the extremes for this exercise. Yeah. So uncertainties, yes, there's a pile of them. We have long screeds in the, at the end of this I'll come back to this. We'll have screeds of pages listing the uncertainties if you want to get into that. Nutrient chlorophyll relationship, I mentioned that before. That's one part that I'd like to see improved. Nitrogen load to come. Those are questions of how much is it attenuated versus how much is a delayed response. This assumption of linearity between loads and concentrations. Some of the source coefficients, that's what we discovered as we went through. It would be nice to tweak them further or get more, reassess some of those if we could. That's normal for modelling. And then we hand it up to the council, say where those things occur, so that they have, the CSG, so that they have a understanding of how good this is or isn't. But there's strengths. It's not a bad model. I think it's suited for the intended purpose. So it's informing policy development. It's not for regulation. It's not being done on a farm site, farm site by farm site, is to get the big picture to inform policy development. Hopefully it's being reasonably transparent and easy to understand. Suited to linking to the economic modelling, so we could slot those calculations straight into Graham's model. Incorporates expert knowledge and makes use of extensive existing data sets. So it's not bad in those, it was pretty good in those respects. And there was one question, yeah.
Just want to ask you what kind of rainfall event you use in your model?
What type of rainfall?
Rainfall event you use in your model?
So it's not an event-based model, it's just an annual average model. So it's more like kind of, you seem to know about it, sort of export coefficient type model. The rainfall, like for E. coli, the loading, the mean annual rainfall affects the amount of E. coli you get off. That was taken into account in the E. coli model. Other model, like for the nitrogen sources, I'm trying to remember, Graham, but they didn't take much cognizance of mean annual rainfall and the nitrogen losses. They were, yeah. That might be something we can come back on is the degree to which rainfall. But it's not an event-based model. It's not an event-based sediment model. Yeah.
I just mentioned for the nutrient chlorophyll relationship be improved. Any ideas of how?
I think that might be a question for tomorrow. Yeah. Yeah.
Sandy, this might be for tomorrow too, but now that the modelling's done, have you compared or has anyone compared it to other modelling exercises in other countries, albeit for different reasons, but possibly similar enough reasons to make that comparison worthwhile? You're saying there are strengths and weaknesses, but in terms of how this model now compares with others that have been used, have you validated that?
I haven't. I expect others might come up with their view on that, later down the process. But in terms of international comparisons, not really. I think a lot of the things we have are specific to New Zealand. The heavy pastoral land use, some of the geothermal sources, you wouldn't get that overseas. Load to come is still internationally is a bit difficult. All those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily going to be kind of the silver bullet arriving from overseas.
I agree that that was more the performance of the model overall.
Yeah, we've done, for this class of modelling, I think the performance is comparable to what you'd expect overseas. So, there is still fairly large residuals that you have. I think the trick that I mentioned before of sort of tying things back to current concentrations, that does save us in some respects, and you don't see that much happening, overseas, and sort of normalising things or correcting for those biases. All right. So yeah, well, I'll go from there, and then but also the chair might have a take on the timing. Okay, cool, so yes.
Can you explain why you use clarity rather than a concentration for sediment? And then also how you then calculate back to get source flows to create the parameter of clarity?
So I sort of mentioned that there's three components there to clarity. People are interested in clarity, so that was, rather than sediment per se, or I think, things are changing in the feed world. So we were interested in clarity, and there is the science around that is this thing called optical cross-section that can be affected by algae and the water absorption from the coloured matter and particular matter.
It's an observed measurement through the water profile.
Yes.
But how do you relate that into the model? Back to source, looking at the yields coming from your land use.
So what we do is we model each of the components that contribute to that clarity, that optical clarity.
And what unit?
Optical cross-section. Yep. So it's the units, well, I can't remember, it's like per metre or something like that. There's a unit of an optical cross-section. So you might, well, actually we talk about it in the reports, but it's you add up optical cross-sections for each of those different components, and then the sediment part, there's a sediment model, and gee, I must have missed something in here, but the sediments again come from actually came from land care research. We broke it down into bank erosion and the rest, and that's one of the reports. So, and then it's tied back to ultimately to the land use and to the geological conditions that came from a model called NZEM from land care. So we took those sediment numbers from them, and that accumulated them down the catchment, attenuated them in the reservoir. Graham might have mitigated them with some riparian planting, so that we have the sediment load then going to the sediment concentration, and then that concentration being related to the optical cross-section of the sediment. And then...
How good was that relationship?
I think we're getting into a bit of a debate here, and there are some other questions, so just hold those questions. I will be suggesting that you actually write your questions coming out of this session down over the lunch break and actually hand them up to us so we have them in some written form. But if just a couple more questions, so that, and then Sandy can sit down.
I think far right, because far right often gets neglected. Yeah.
Oh, kia ora.
Look,
just with regards to mātauranga Māori, and obviously the modelling that I'm seeing is all Western science, but how is mātauranga Māori going to be used in regards to, input into these models that you're providing?
Yeah. So Bryce might be able to, get some perspective on that. Yeah.
Yes, as I said before, this modelling is a component of the whole. It's only part of the whole that Graham and Sandy are describing. Other components of work that were done included work on Mātauranga Māori, led by Antoine Coffin, who was part of the technical leaders group and interacted with the different river iwi through that process. And so there's reports on that website describing that. There is also reports that people should not ignore that are there around integrated assessment, and that's taking a more holistic view and bringing the values that Māori have around water and Mātauranga Māori into that integrated assessment. And so you will see a report on that says, well, if we do these things and improve the water quality by this much, and this came from the workshops that were held with River Iwi at the time, if we do these things and we improve the water quality like this, what does it do to some of those values? Does it move them at all or not? Is it irrelevant? or does it move them a lot? And you will see in those reports, you will see, I've forgotten the name of the plot that you look at, but basically you will see how much it moves in response to improvements in the hour. So that's how it's described. How it's incorporated into the ongoing hearings process, and that's not a question. That's not a question for me. But I hope that's helped a little bit, Cam.
Oh, just one more question. So in the Waikato River Independent Scaping Study, they gave Mātauranga and the Māori Western sites equal weighting. I just want to know, in regards to this integrated approach, when you make your final decision, that remains the same. Because obviously, if you have Western sites giving a view, and the Mātauranga giving another view, I think that's where I'm getting to. It won't be assumed just purely on the Western sites.
I won't comment on that policy side of it. What I will say is that the technical work, or the work to enable that, has been done. To the extent that it has been done. So the information to inform the process is there. So how well it's used is not for me to say.
All right, thank you. Just one more question for Sandy, then we need to move on to Graham. We've got questions this afternoon, so don't worry, your questions will come back, but we do need to get Graham underway before lunchtime so that you've got a chance to actually think about all three of them in terms of questions over lunch. Who's biggest? Sorry, you lose out on shoulder mass. Yes.
Thank you very much. Sandy, I've just got a little question about the annual average. Is it possible for the model to produce scenarios for summer and winter? I just know that there are a lot of questions that are being raised by various growers and farmers about what difference does it make being an annual average versus a summer and a winter, and can we learn something from the model about the difference in different flow regimes and weather, environments?
Well, the current model, no, it doesn't do that. It wasn't constructed to do that. It's a big push to try and get it to do that, especially in the stream modelling, river modelling context. Would it be desirable? Ideally, yes. We always knew that and we say this in the reports, that it would be desirable in the long term to have those in place. Yep.
Right, Graham, no, but as I said just a moment ago, if you want to put your questions down on pieces of paper and give them to Steve over lunch, then we'll attempt to put some sort of rational distribution around those. Graham.
I don't know if that'll be much better. But, no, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming. It's actually like a bit of a family reunion this morning. Great to be alongside people that we first started this process 2012. The first week I started with this process, some people have been right there from the start. So it's great to see the faces back in the room, and some involved in other processes throughout the country as well, as we work through what's a very important issue close to all of our hearts, and especially at the national scene, at the national scale. I love how my name is in red there. I don't know what that's meant to signify, but
It's your turn.
Yeah. Maybe there's something deeper, I don't know. But anyway, so I'm here to talk about the economic modelling, especially we call it the scenario model.
Can you stand near the mic so we can talk?
Yes.
Talk into the mic.
What, do you think the mic is better?
Yes.
Yes, I can if you like.
We've got a mobile one.
Yeah, we've got a mobile one as well.
Yeah.
Yep, we'll have to stand and deliver them. But anyway, so this is the crude like. Is it on? No.
It's on.
That one. Is that one on? Yep. No, excellent. So thank you very much. So really we spoke about the scenario model. When we spoke about the integrated assessment earlier on, which Bryce raised, that was a very key point. That was a very key point that Bryce raised, because the output of the economic modelling went into the integrated assessment process, as did the Mātauranga Māori input to the process. It was, it was based around social aspects of the different proposed policies as well, or trying to look more broad scale. But in terms of where I contributed primarily to the process was through the economic modelling. And so back in 2012, started to be involved with a central government-led project. We were going through developing the regulatory impact statement for the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. And there was a project known as the EJV, which was the Economic Joint Venture, which was a joint venture between the Waikato River Authority, central government, and WRC, whereby, and also industry bodies as well, whereby we were bringing the different, and Department of Conservation as well, I think. I may have missed one or two other organisations as well, but we were coming together to start doing some preliminary work in the catchment, in the Waikato River catchment. This was very focused on the upper Waikato region, so I don't know whether it encompassed all of the upper Waikato FMU that we studied in Healthy Rivers. However, it was quite a intensive study. There was a lot of data collection, and I was responsible for the economic modelling towards the end of that process. We weren't looking. It wasn't involving a participatory group at any stage. It wasn't led towards Healthy Rivers. It was more focused around central government needs, but also getting the local players together and starting to think about water quality in some integrated way. And so that was early on within the Healthy Rivers process. There was an assessment done by a range of people at an expert workshop about what was the best way to move forward with this economic model, with what the form of the economic modelling. And particularly when we make decisions around different types of model, it's a resource. We're trying to get the maximum insight within the resources that we had available. So, every time we make modelling decisions, we're basing it around how much expertise we have, how much data we have, how much time we have. For example, we've already spoken about about maybe the annual average model in terms of water quality. Maybe we should have thought about delineating it across season. During the process of Healthy Rivers, various people mentioned that we should have a daily model. So a daily model of water quality within the Waikato River lakes. The processes of the cost and time required to construct a model of that kind, and then also also applying that model. We were at a during the CSG process, it was quite an intensive time. There was time where the gaps during which the model work had to be done it was quite constrained, and so taking all that into account, those constraints had quite a significant impact. They were the contextual elements that drove various modelling decisions that were made. And so there was a decision early on which was around building on top of the economic joint venture model, which was developed through 2012-2013, particularly because there had been strong stakeholder involvement throughout that process. And that strong stakeholder involvement in terms of the industries especially was very, we found it very good, because it was, people had provided information, the industries had provided information which gave us stronger insight into the costs of abatement, for example, across a range of important sectors. However, during Healthy Rivers, of course, the problem was much bigger than just the upper part of the catchment, and so we went through quite an intensive stage of extending it to the whole catchment. We went from about 13 or 14 sub-catchments right up to about 74. And also, Healthy Rivers is not just about nitrogen and phosphorus. I think within that EJV model we'd studied nitrogen principally, but also phosphorus. But within this work we also had to think about E. coli and sediment as well. And that's quite an interesting point. I noticed that this morning when I was looking at the questions. Some people do see, some people have raised questions and points around nitrogen, and we do get that. But at the same time, it's really principally important to identify that this is Healthy Rivers focuses on all 4 contaminants: phosphorus, nitrogen, E. coli, and sediment. And also we did expert workshops and a broad range of literature review and engagement to find out what is the best way or most meaningful way to represent a range of different mitigations within the economic modelling. And then there was a parallel work stream or workflow that Sandy and others at NIWA had been contributing to, and that involved five hydrological models. So we had a sediment model, a nitrogen model, a phosphorus model, an E. coli model, and also the relationship that related sediment, yellow substance, and nitrogen and phosphorus to and algae, to clarity. And that's there was a question before about what the quality of the fit was for the visual clarity model. It's actually on a report on the WRC website. I think it's in the same report related to the sediment modelling and the sediment attenuation, but that seeks to describe the quality of those relationships and shows the functional form and parameters as well. So that would be a good resource. And that is a lot of information, a lot of detailed reports are available for the material that we're talking about today. So, wouldn't stop to emphasise, I wouldn't under-emphasise the importance of that written material. And so the economic model integrated the NIWA models, but also a lot of information from different areas, which was representing nitrogen losses from various uses, both point source and diffuse source, and then also the cost of different means of mitigating that. And so it drew on a wealth of existing data. There was some really strong data that came, some really useful and strong data coming from the economic joint venture process, but also there was data made available by sectors more generally. And also we had to gather some new data. For example, sediment losses that we were talking about, sediment losses across the whole catchment. There'd been no prior estimation of that for the entire catchment, and so we had to commission some new work whereby estimated sediment loads for the whole catchment in terms of hill slope erosion and stream bank erosion. And in the end, that was integrated through the economic scenario modelling, or the scenario model. Probably the best way to think about it, or an integrated economic hydrological model, where we studied land use and land management. So it was actually quite a standard formalism or framework, economics framework. Within such a framework, we try and think about, there's various ways that it can be utilised, but really what we're trying to think about is, as we investigate different scenarios, what is the cost of that relative to the current state? And these costs, so this model was based at the catchment level. When we're at the catchment level, the output of that was fed into a level, into a regional model, which sought to gauge, which sought to estimate the flow-on impacts of mitigation activity and flow-on impacts on land use change up to the district, FMU, and regional and national scale. And so that was that was an extension to this work, but one that Market Economics in Auckland were responsible for. And so the model itself was quite large. Early on in the process, we had people asking us, saying, we want a full copy of the model. We need full insight into the model. So the model's been online now for 3 years. I haven't received any questions about it, but happy to provide comment on it. But we also had the structure of the model. Yes?
So where online is this model?
It's in the Technical Alliance documents for Waikato Regional Council. There's a page called Technical Alliance Documents. We were the Technical Leaders Group, which was part of what was known as the Technical Alliance. We are the, there's a and a report in there that contains the model description of the model structure. And we had it peer reviewed. It's built in a modelling language, probably one of the more, probably the world leading language for optimization modelling, economic modelling. There's a North American economist who wrote the user guide literally for this software and also has won a Nobel Prize. He was our peer reviewer. We got very good feedback on the model in terms of how to improve it, but also on its overall structure. And so he provided the main insight. However, we also received a range of other reviewers as well who were national and who were within New Zealand and could understand the kind of national context. And so we did, a normal process of peer review, and also I think we followed the principle that peer review or expert input was more valuable at the start because that gave us opportunity to build it in right from the start before we even got to the CSG interaction. Modelling and limit setting processes. I worked as an economic advisor to the Ministry for the Environment for 5 years, where my job was to think about the role of economic modelling and limit setting processes. It's a fascinating context, especially from the regulatory context, the legislative context. It really is a continuum of complexity. Like I've modelled individual farms, collections of hundreds of individual farms, trying to see whether that helps us. I've modelled, whole catchments represented by 2 or 3 farms, for example, which is the generality at the other end. I've seen all scales within New Zealand. I see it all the time across different limit setting processes, economics applied in different ways. The reality is that there's no right way. Each one has its limitations. We are dealing with a very interesting problem here. There's pervasive uncertainty given what we're studying. There's value conflicts, which I think is probably why a lot of you are here. And so within that context of value conflicts and pervasive scientific uncertainty, there's kind of course, reaching consensus is difficult, or as I was talking at the airport with Graham the other day and saying consensus is something that we always aim to do, but it's always challenging, very difficult, some would say even impossible within these means. But what we try and do is we're trying to gain some understanding. That's what I really appreciated my role within the technical leaders group. We were seeking to provide an independent oversight of policies or an unbiased and central view and insight into the questions being raised by the collaborative stakeholder group. And that was a really interesting position. And one that I find that consensus is difficult. However, you're also another thing that we have that pervasive uncertainty. The thing is, there was a lot of money spent throughout the Healthy Rivers process, but you could, even if there'd been spent a lot more, we would still have those inherent uncertainty and that inherent conflict, so we'd still be here. That is the reality of it all. The thing is, we can never know everything. And like there were calls during Healthy Rivers to talk about, there were calls for a daily model. That's another example, that would have been very costly. And so within this kind of really difficult scientific context, what we was tasked to do was to provide insight in an unbiased way, but also within strong constraints based around data, time and expertise. And so within that, particularly given those complexities, what we're faced with is that every model is imperfect. I think the common one is people say every model is wrong. However, what I find is that if models, you can usually identify model structure is very important. So that's why it's very important to get peer review, but also to align with traditional or standard formalisms. So what we applied here was a very standard form of modelling, probably the most popular type of economic model applied in New Zealand was applied in Healthy Rivers. Yes, I'd say it would be easily, I'd say maybe 3/4 of the economic models used in New Zealand to judge the economic impact of water quality policy were probably models of this kind. And so I think that is, that helps align. It shows we've got a strong conceptual foundation that we're building on, and it helps us understand the weaknesses, but also understands the strengths. But the application was complex. Like we were, this was a difficult process. We had short timelines. There was a lot of complexity. There was strong conflict among CSG, about what should be in the model, what should be outside of the model. There was a strong diversity in model literacy among the CSG, which made it harder again. We had people who had never heard of economic modelling, and then we had people who were, who had been involved in the development and application of hundreds of models. So, it's very kind of complex social context within which the modelling took place as well. And so right through the CSG process, we received very strong recommendations to improve the model, keep going. Some people said it was too complex, some people said it was too simple. So the key thing was people say, when do you stop development? When is the model good enough? In the end, we were under time constraints, and we reached a stage where we believed it was in line with what would usually, what would constitute a model that is suitable for purpose, and so did our reviewers. And so at that stage, it was deemed appropriate to that it could provide insight into the questions at hand.
Graham, if your slides are equal value, you've got another 2 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, it's going good. You might be here a while. I can stop earlier if you'd like, David, but I'll just keep on going until I run out of time. Yeah, so the models can be used in various ways. We actually, with our interaction with the collaborative stakeholder group, we used 3 different approaches. The first one was where we looked at 4 scenarios, and there's a very detailed report within the, there's actually 2 different reports that relate to this within the Technical Alliance documents. This was, the CSG came up with 4 scenarios. Scenario 1 was the most aspirational. It was requiring substantial improvement in water quality to meet the vision and strategy of water quality aspirations. I think the general, really that the importance of that first report, what the first report generally showed was that the vision and strategy sets very high water quality aspirations. It also showed that our productive industries, agriculture and horticulture, that it's difficult to reduce a wide range of contaminants. So it's difficult to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment and E. coli within our productive industries to meet those water quality aspirations in a very short time frame. And I don't think that surprised many people. I think people knew that at the start. And so that was actually informed subsequent debate within the CSG. And I think that's been well documented as well through the CSG about how they proposed to deal with that. Their proposal wasn't all the pain at once. What they said, no, we're going to set out a time frame. A time frame saying that we've actually taken many years to get where we are. We're probably going to take, we're going to set an 8-year time frame to work towards that now. And so that led to a subsequent lot of modelling where we were modelling the steps towards scenario 1 over an 80-year time frame. Because an important part of that transition as well is that there was a motivation to start slowly, because at the same time there's adaptation. There will be benefits arising from adaptation. We know that, like I was in a meeting yesterday with Beef and Lamb NZ, and we were talking about what happened in response to the removal of subsidies back in the 1980s. With the transformation within the sheep and beef sector has been significant. Since that time, like production has increased, productivity has increased, should I say, and quite enormously. And so, really this was quite important. That first step is that we gather momentum, we get used to working together, but also we start thinking about how people can adapt. And so really there was a second report as well, which looked at the various steps. What is the cost of these different steps? And at what stage did a movement towards the aspirations of scenario 1 really start kicking in? And so what it was really built off was this fact that we can actually start the path and work some of the way, but at what the CSG thought might be a cost to the community, which was worth the benefits that it was seeing in terms of moving towards those aspirational targets. And then after that round of modelling, we did quite a bit of modelling through that period, but the CSG did a lot of learning, but there was also a lot of debate within the CSG. But there was also a lot of peripheral work, like there was no, sometimes what we see in these limit setting processes is a lot of attention paid to the economic modelling and the environmental modelling, but within this process, the economic model contributed to, but didn't come up with the policy scenario. The policy scenario emerged from a collaborative stakeholder group, which was informed by an integrated assessment. The integrated assessment contained information from a broad range of sources, and the economic assessment was one of those. And that economic assessment also contained the water quality aspirations. And so how the modelling worked within that initial exploratory modelling is that we had Sandy's models represented within our economic model, and we were working off very much a national objectives framework structure, whereby water quality for different attributes. So water quality was measured in terms of different attributes. For example, 95th percentile of nitrate. There was various bands, A, B, C and D. They had been developed. I think we had 9 attributes represented in the model, ranging across all related to those primary loads of 4 contaminants. And there was the Waikato Objectives Framework, which had been developed based on the NOF and based through extensive consultation. And the CSG would identify what the targets they would like met at each site. So we had 74 sub-catchments, a high number of monitoring sites, over 60, and at each of those monitoring sites we had different attributes measured. At some of them we had 9 attributes, some of them we might have much less. For example, in the main stem we would have total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and algae chlorophyll A measurements alongside other attributes. In a small stream, you wouldn't expect to see those same chlorophyll A measurements. They weren't, they weren't of interest to the CSG at those points. So there was strong debate around where those attributes were measured and which ones were appropriate where. So within the economic model, we would set those targets. We would set those targets at the different nodes or at the different measuring points, given that attenuation and the flow paths within the catchment, and then the model would actually identify how to achieve those attributes at least cost. And so the process by which it does that is a process of what's known as optimization. The model is an optimization model which uses a kind of a trial and error search approach quite efficiently. So it's quite a large model, it's over 50,000 equations, but through there it's got an automated search process looking for the combination of decision variables or of land use and land management decisions that minimises the cost of achieving those water quality ends or those water quality targets. And those targets are set in terms of concentration at each of those sub-catchment nodes or monitoring stations. And so that's how the optimization modelling was used in the first 2. In the last one, the CSG actually developed the policy scenario independently. So they had looked at all of the, up to that stage they'd done a lot of learning, a lot of debate, and through that they'd come up with a, what would you call it, a policy bundle. And then, so during that last stage, what we did was we took their proposed policy, tried to represent it in the best way possible within the model, and then ran the model. So rather than optimizing, so beforehand we were running the model to achieve certain targets in the water. In this one, within this one, we actually put the policy in. We defined what land use and land management options we used, and then the model told us what the water quality outcomes and economic outcomes associated with those were. Yes?
Just a point of clarification on the, when you've got costs there,
yes.
does that is there an allowance in there for a reduction in capital value of land, or is that?
That is not. Do you know? It is. It's a very good question. Of course, you know, people would. Well, what economic theory tells it. Well, the first answer is no. No, the capital value of land is not included in the model. Secondly, we would say that we would believe, though, that we could get insights into it, given that the profitability of land is tied to its, the value of land is tied to its profitability, and we represent profitability. So when we look at those, when we look at a decline in profitability, we would usually associate that with a decline in the value of that land. And I think that's, you know, throughout New Zealand we see that. But it wasn't included explicitly within the model, but implicitly, I think, based on the model outputs, you can assess some changes in land value. And so we simulated the proposed policy mix. There was land use change, intensification restrictions, policies around nitrogen, stream fencing, tailored farm environmental plans, which were rolled out according to the prioritisation of different subcatchments. There was assumptions around point sources, and there was also different provisions for developing iwi land. And so this is quite a sharp description of them all, quite a concise description of them all. That is all detailed in further detail within the report that's associated with this work. And so the key questions from the collaborative stakeholder group were: what are the estimated costs of implementing the policy? And then what are the estimated water quality benefits of implementing the proposed policy? And so even though people had spoken about, so what we had found was during our earlier economic modelling, before we assessed the policy, people had said we want to work towards a 10%, we want to work towards a 10% improvement in water quality, or water quality concentrations or attributes. When they developed the policy, they actually developed it based on the inputs or actions. And so what we found is that once we modelled that, the impact in the water was quite different from 10%. In some cases, it was up to, it was much larger improvement than that, because they weren't really, their proposed policy package wasn't aiming for 10% so much as it was around which actions do they think would be feasible and valuable in terms of water quality. And so we looked at some impacts. This is a short description of the economic impacts. So this is our current level as assessed within our economic modelling. So total profit of about 915 million within the catchment. This was about 2015, I think the numbers were. With the policy mix, we see that the dry stock, or really mixed farming or sheep and beef farming hasn't suffered too much significantly in terms of direct farm management. However, there are other costs associated with it. Dairying, there was about a 2% decline. Horticulture, some decline. But where we saw a lot of the costs was actually coming from things which were almost not part of the day-to-day farm management. Our effluent upgrade was one capital expense, but also we had stream fencing was quite a large expense. This is annual figures in terms of millions, so it's an annual capitalised cost. We had erosion control, quite significant investment in farm plans to reduce erosion loss. We also had a lot of high age of field investment. So by age of field, I'm talking about detention bunds, integrated detention bunds and small wetland systems, and different sizes of wetland, which are based in different parts of the catchment based on their hydrology and geography. And so the cost was assessed at about 4% of profit, 4% of profit. And also we could see this is total nitrogen, median total nitrogen concentration from the first site on the main stem right down to the end of the river. And we can see it still builds under, we can see overall it increases as you'd expect, because as the river flows, there's more there's more nutrient coming into it because the amount of agricultural land feeding into the river increases as we move down. So we find our model current state moves along that red line, but under the policy mix we find the blue line is leading to a significant reduction by the time we move to the bottom. Also with the E. coli, really, like, there's more information within our report around these results, but E. coli and clarity were the ones that were really showing a significant benefit. Yes?
Does the implementation of those control measures take into account the lost productivity of the space, physical area required for the implementation of those controls?
Yes. Short answer. Yeah. This, yes, and especially some of those controls, I know, the erosion control ones, I know for riparian buffers it was, for wetlands it was. The hard one that I always struggle with is space planting, space planting of poplars on the hills. The reduction, like you find usually that the shading reduces pasture growth underneath a poplar tree, but at the same time you're holding the soil there, and also you might lose some pasture quality because you can't put your cattle in there right away because they can chew it. They can chew your poplar wands or the poplar poles, or they can scratch themselves on it so it goes over like that and you get a poplar tree growing on a flipping 45-degree angle. So that one I found difficult, but we worked through some really key people to try and understand that in more detail. Yes?
Just on that same question, did that modelling take into account the mitigation costs? Because the examples that I saw through on the technical leaders group, it didn't show the cost of the mitigation. And when Federated Farmers did their study on one farm there, it went potentially on how it was interpreted between 250 and 750,000 on mitigation. Did your modelling take into account that economic impact on that farm, because it potentially make it unviable?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of that. Is that there's three probably points that I should cover. First of all, the economic, the focus of this modelling was the economic cost. Secondly, when we focused on those costs, they were annualised, and so they were annual, but that they could be as high as 700,000 if you put all of them. If you didn't annualise it, if you put them, for example, if you put in a standoff pad, for a cow to reduce nitrogen leaching, it might have some high cost when you look at it on a total basis, but if you annualise it, it will go down by about 90% because it's an annual figure.
The problem is the bank mightn't look at it that way if you have to borrow the money.
No, but if you borrow the money, you still have to pay it back annually, don't you? You don't pay back. You don't pay back.
80 years.
No. So all of our capitalised, what we focused on was a 25-year period payback on it. And also the Federated Farmers figures, I haven't, I suppose that'll be, throughout the process, we'll get a better opportunity to actually get into their figures and see how they differ. But there's there's one more point, I think, which is really important as well, and the one that we didn't study was the impact on debt. So I know once you decrease that profitability, that can impact the distribution of debt within a farm population. That's one thing we didn't study within this. And so that's one thing that's a good...
Just one quick point on that. Maintenance costs of any infrastructure that we put in, is that inside your costs?
Yes, it is. Yes, and there's a mitigation report as well where we try to document all those assumptions. Yes, and so this is looking at the 95th percentile of E. coli. There are some very high E. coli readings within the catchment. So we see right up here. So this is for the 74 sites. This box and whisker plot is showing the distribution of the 95th percentile E. coli across the 60-something subcatchments where E. coli is measured. And I think it's 63. But what we find here is that it's got a very broad distribution. We find that under the policy mix, the median does go down quite significantly. under each case. So this is for the 4 different freshwater management units within the study region. We have 4 different FMUs, or freshwater management units. We see the median E. coli reducing, median value of 95th percentile E. coli across the subcatchments where it's measured, declining in each case. And we see that is very pronounced here in the central region. At the lower Waikato, we see a bit more closer, a closer distribution, but higher in general. Given that we've got that aggregation effect as we come down the river, we're seeing higher levels overall for the 95th percentile. But we see that the policy mix did have some impact, is showing quite a significant impact in terms of decreasing that median. So really, in terms of the policy mix simulation, what we identified was that the policy mix will impact economic outcomes. There are costs associated with that. Already from the questions, what we've highlighted is a few gaps, things that weren't considered, and also an opportunity to identify things that were. The cost does vary across the sectors, and also will vary spatially within each sector. So there'll be some farms on some soil type that are on some soil types within one part of the catchment that are affected to a different degree, than others elsewhere in the catchment. Really, when we looked at the water quality, we saw quite a phenomenal increase in water quality. We weren't improving water quality overall by 2%. We were well past that, I think. The policy was really quite aspirational. The CSG did develop the policy package. They were aiming towards 10%, but they focused on the actions, and they came up with something which we believe would actually surpass that 10% quite markedly in some instances. However, we do, under the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, we have, we need to maintain or improve. However, there is some very difficult dynamics here, some hydrological dynamics. We've got a lag of nitrogen sitting in the lag of nitrogen load to come, and that's going to force some of the attribute levels for nitrogen to increase before they decrease. At some sites it will get worse before it gets better, and that is just part of the geology, part of the stylised facts of management within this catchment, I believe. And there was research done in that field as well. A lot of research done during our process in that kind of area. So actions can take time to be fully effective, but water quality improvements can be expected over the 10-year plan period, especially for E. coli and also for clarity. But it will take time. It'll take time to work through this process, but it will also take time to adopt or implement processes. And even once we plant a poplar tree, for example, for the time it takes to account for the root growth to bind the soil, that can take a number of years as well. So, we've started a process, but the process is a difficult one. It will take many years for us to work through this. Hoping one day, that the river has improved in the last few years, but we hope that the river keeps on improving along that trajectory, and hopefully this is part of that process. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Graham. I've got a question now.
Yes.
Graham, I'm just looking at the discussion you've got here. You talk about modelling the policy aspects and the mitigations to meet the policy goals, which are generally a fairly high level aspiration.
I think that's wrong. We never modelled the policy goals. We evaluated the cost it would take to reach a set of aspirational goals set out by the collaborative stakeholder group, and then after that they defined a policy and we evaluated that policy. But when they defined that policy, they didn't have water quality concentration targets as part of that. We modelled the inputs that they suggested as the policy mix and then gauged its effect on water quality.
Engaged effects would be greater than 10%.
Yes.
So the question I've got is, how does that tally with the estimates that came out of Waikato Regional Council about the benefits of, say, the rules, which is where it gets for, neither gets for road. So the 75 percentile rule was estimated to reduce nitrogen loss by about 4 or 5% in the catchments that they were working to. So have you done a model and assessment on the effect of the rules as opposed to the effect of the policy?
This is the effect. Well, I think I think we'll need to discuss it further because I'm actually confused by your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Have you read the policy mix report that I've done? Because that I think that.
Yeah, what I was thinking of is the benefits of reduction in nitrogen loss on a catchment as a whole.
Yes.
Was estimated to be only about 4 or 5%. Yet looking at this, you're saying, well, the water quality generally is going to be much greater than 10%. So
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering how they all tie together.
No, I think that there's a misperception in here. I think there's a misreading So I think first of all, the 75th percentile you're talking about is dairy farms. The highest leach is above 75%, coming down to 75%, aren't they? And what the assessment is, there was about 3 or 4 assessments done by the technical group that assessed what would the reduction in total nitrogen load be that associated with that. And that was 4 or 5% reduction in nitrogen load. And does that align with what you're saying so far?
That's what I'm concerned about, yeah.
Yes.
So how do those rules...
And so that was modelled in there. Yeah, so there's a
policy. And what's the economic consequence of those?
Yes, exactly. And that was assessed like that. So that policy you're talking about is assessed in here, and it's part of that policy mix report. So definitely, yes. So it's definitely assessed alongside the policy mix, given that the policy mix was that was an explicit part of it. So yeah, sorry if...
it's encompassed within that.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I'm sorry if I misunderstood. Yes.
Was the urban contribution to this contamination, if you like, built into your models at all, and has that been mitigated or sort of lessened over the 10-year period, or how does that fit in?
Yes, the urban contribution was included, and there were options for mitigating the urban load, and we did make assumptions around what the urban load, what was going to happen to it, whether it was going to increase or not, given that there are other things which come into play, such as local government legislation and population growth. And so that's detailed, in that report as well. But we did deal with the urban load, definitely. And it's not just, I talk a lot here about diffuse pollution, or a lot about the land use, or the pollution from the land use, or the loadings, the pollutant loads from the land use, but it was definitely an integrated urban and rural land use model.
Graham, just to mention that there's the point source aspect as well, so sewage treatment plants, which is sort of another urban-related aspect which is dealt with separately.
Yes, it's a good point. Yes, Chris?
Cheers, Graham. The question about the cost of mitigation is, if I recall, the cost of the mitigation is measured in terms of the on-farm costs. And then you talked about the role of market economics in taking it to a regional model and a national model. So can you just explain a little bit more about how the translation costs, because say for example with horticulture, a lot of the value is created in the post-harvest environment, in the back house or in the supermarket and all of that sort of thing. How does that get translated back into the economic outcome that we're seeing from the changes which are proposed?
Yes. So Chris has raised a good point. Of course, like I was modelling it very much what we call it the catchment scale. So we were representing quite a rich as richer description as we could within our constraints of the land use itself, and how farm income or farm profit would change as a result of different policies or different mitigation uses. But then there's the next step, and the next step was actually performed by market economics. I wonder if they're the best ones to answer that, Chris, because I can't remember the specifics around how horticulture was dealt with. So
I just think generally,
yeah,
it would be really important for us to understand how that was done in terms of, working through the evidence that was presented to us.
Yes, and that's what I'm wondering. Yes, and that's so there's kind of two parts to that. First of all, we do have maybe 3 points. First of all, we have that of course we had detailed reports from market economics which provide some introduction to that. Secondly, I think we must include market economics as part of this moving forward. Thirdly, just my take on it generally is that what we did within our modelling was to break down the effects of the policy, how it would affect the expenditure of different expenditures of the farmer. So for example, if we built a standoff pad, where would that money go? Where would it go? What sector would it go into? And then we had a flow from that sector into another. For example, if we have it going into the sector, how does that flow into other sectors? And so what we actually try to get at is how are these changes in how are these changes in economic activity flowing through the economy? So if a farmer has $100 less to spend this year, and the person in the local grocery store is not getting that $100, what's happening there? And so very difficult with an economic modelling to do that, and that's why the integrated assessment was utilised or employed, and that was because the integrated assessment, we actually wanted to go further than that. One thing is saying we've got $100 less, we're going to spend, we're not going to spend that in the grocery store, this might mean less jobs. So we also use that work to assess employment, but the integrated assessment actually said, what does that mean for the wider schools? What does it mean? Are we going to, if we bring in this policy, what is it going to do to our local school? Are we going to be more vibrant? Are we going to have better access to waterways? Is our mahinga kai going to be improved? So the integrated assessment we brought together about a lot of people, and that's where that really focused on what are the implications of this stuff that we're actually talking about.
All right, thanks, Graham. No, I'm going to, sorry guys, I'm going to close it down for this morning's session since it's now 12:20. Thank you very much, Graham. I think you've done your 5-kilometre walking today as well, haven't you? Right. I'm suggesting that we resume here, shall we say, at 1:10, which is about 50 minutes. It will be a full questioning session this afternoon. So if you do have questions, and you can write them down and give them to Steve before we resume, that would be helpful. And if you do that, please identify who you are in terms of which questions you're asking. We'll see you back here at 1:10. Thank you very much. As has been pointed out to me, we're well past the start time, and the reason for that is that I think most of us were unable to get lunch, and so had to go somewhere else and end up in a queue about 3 miles long. So unfortunately, that's how it's panned out. So thank you for alerting me to that. I appreciate that. Right.
We bought our own sandwiches and had no problem.
Well, you're very wise, aren't you? You probably grow your own as well, don't you? Yes, what did you put in the soil, by the way?
Compost.
All right, thank you. Now, Graham has to be away at 2:00, so I'm suggesting that we actually deal with the questions that are directed towards Graham in the next half hour. And looks like we've got a few questions. Right, okay. So, Graham, if you maybe start with the questions that we've had in advance, and I'm not sure how many of those are actually, well, the first one for starting has you against a number of them, so maybe if you could just work through those questions and just paraphrase or read, whichever you like, the question that's been put. Wouldn't mind? Yes. Thank you. Can I just clarify too? It was at the beginning we noted that Rob Drayton was here for Waikato Regional Council. That is incorrect. He's actually a consultant engaged by WRC, so he's not actually WRC's representative. And I'm not sure. Rob, do you want to tell us what the avenue now is for anything that goes through? Mike.
Mike
Yes.
Scarsbrook at the front.
All right, Mike, do you want to just introduce yourself to the group, please?
Kia ora koutou, I'm Mike Scarsbrook and I'm the Science Manager at Waikato Regional Council. In my previous existence I was also a member of the TLG. So any questions that Daniel can't address directly, we can capture those within Waikato Regional Council and make sure that information gets captured and provide answers to those questions. So hopefully we can help.
Can I just clarify, will those also be questions which touch on policy matters? Will
No.
you take those?
No, I think.
They're not for today?
No, I think.
Yeah, no, we're certainly, we're constrained in terms of what we're doing. You have questions of a policy nature, then by all means put them through to WRC, but that's not part of this process. Thank you, Mike. Right, Graham, over to you.
Yes, I was just wondering if the respondent, Anna Santini. Yes, because that would be mainly, definitely useful to kind of work through the questions as well, because to ask you just for further clarifications as well. I see. Yes. And is there some way that if I just describe some of the answers to them, is there a way that you can feed those back to them in a way that makes sense to you? Good start. Because this first question that was raised by the Auckland Waikato Fish and Game Council was asking whether an attempt was made to do a CBA, which is cost-benefit analysis, rather than a cost analysis, or even the analysis of the relative shapes of the marginal cost and marginal benefit curves. I might need roving mic, I'm sorry. Steve, is this a roving mic? Oh, sorry. Yep. Hopefully that's on there now. Yes, so that first question is talking about usually we have dollars here and the amount of nutrient abated down here, and where the question is coming from is that we would expect as more abatement is done, the we're having a marginal abatement cost, very important. We get them the right way around. Of course, what we have with these are the marginal costs of abatement and marginal abatement cost and marginal abatement benefit. So in economic theory, what it tells us is that if we're looking at these two curves, that we should keep on abating until the benefit from abating nitrogen is equal to its cost of doing so. So in economic theory, that tells us we try and monetize. So we need a monetary value of the cost. So if we put in for example, if we fence a kilometre of stream, then that's going to have a certain cost. But at the same time, there's some change in the water quality across multiple contaminants. And if we used this model, we would have to monetize those values. So if we just say if we put in a stream fence, we might reduce E. coli load by 60%. We have to come up with a relationship that takes this change in the physical world. So I'll just write this down. So we have a stream fence. A stream fence. If we put in a stream fence, then we incur the cost of that. But at the same time, we decrease E. coli input to the stream by about 60%, I think, on average, people say. And so then we actually have to put a dollar value on that reduction if you're using the standard environmental economics model of environmental improvement. So this is our optimal level of abatement for society, is where the marginal costs of abatement are equal to the marginal benefit. And so the question the submitter is saying, why haven't we used this approach? Whereas what we did was come up with a physical target for E. coli based on the CSG process. The CSG came up with a physical target for E. coli, and we studied the cost of attaining that target. The reason why we didn't take this approach is that, firstly, we were dealing with a collaborative stakeholder group who were determining that this collaborative stakeholder group were determining attribute targets at multiple subcatchments. Suggesting.
Yes, suggesting. Suggesting attribute targets across these
different subcatchments, of which there were 74. And so that we ended up with targets of about, there was a high number, hundreds of different attribute targets. If we'd taken this approach, then we would have had to try and identify the relationship between attribute levels at each subcatchment level and how different people value that change in water quality for those 9 attributes. And so given, I'm unaware of anywhere in the world where that's been done before, given that there are, a high number of sites, so well in excess of 50 sites, we've got 9 attributes. How do we monetize the relationship between the change in the physical world and the change in societal value? And even then, the only way to do that credibly is through surveying a lot of people, but at the same time, we're actually getting the CSG are acting as the people who are guiding what society wants in terms of that level of targeted water quality. And so there was kind of almost, there was too low a resource, there was technical difficulties in that the number of relationships we would need would be very numerous, and also the CSG process made it a lot more difficult given that they were already guiding the physical targets. So that's probably the best summary I can do of that one here, sorry. The second one is the appropriateness of a short-run analysis with no reallocation of labour, given that the water quality limits aimed at representing long-term goals. And so I think that's mainly targeted at the work that market economics did. We were looking very much at a medium to long-run term, but what they're saying there is that within our modelling where we looked at local and regional and national level changes, we were saying that there's no market for labour. Just like in the market for housing, if you have over-demand and over-supply, the price will adjust. So, if we had an over-demand of houses, the prices increase, or excess demand for housing, the prices increase. The same can happen for other resources, such as labour or capital. And so what this question is pertaining to is that we didn't represent those relationships when we looked at the district, regional, and national level impacts. And it comes down to a modelling choice between what's known as an input-output model or a computable general equilibrium model. And we use an input-output model, which is the most widely used economic model in the world. And also it is, given the time that we had available and the data as well, to build a CGE model for this problem would have probably cost close to $1 million, and we wouldn't have had the data to populate it. Our input-output model was formalism's been widely used. It's a standard for this form of analysis in New Zealand. It's widely used for assessing the effects of these types of policies, and the kind of requirements in terms of data, expertise and time were consistent with what we had available. And so we thought, that was our justification, is that it's well used, well known, and also consistent with the resourcing of the project. And so our third question was, what's the role in application?
Just before you go there, Graham, you've got about 24 questions
yes,
here
exactly.
that have just come in. That's probably maybe, yeah.
Oh, well, if you like that, yes.
But I think you do need to just shorten up a little bit if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, no, of course.
Thank you.
Yep, so the next question is, what was the role and application of work modelling nutrient loads in the Waikato and Waipark catchments and the development of catchment scale models commissioned for the Healthy Rivers project, and how is that work being utilised, including the attenuation factors reached? That's a wide-ranging question, but really it's answered through the reports and what we described before.
I think we also hopefully we also addressed that through the presentations, showing how the linkages between the water quality are linked into the economics. So hopefully you got that understanding from that.
Yes. Yes. And then I don't know if everybody else has this list up, sorry. And I know it's a bit of a but we have another question here, the costs and benefits of applying a 75% nitrogen N-loss threshold limit. That was by that, I'm assuming the 75 in-loss threshold limit is that for dairy farming, bringing the people who are above that limit down to the 75th percentile. The costs and benefits were assessed for that in the policy mix evaluation that I presented results for earlier, and also have and also in the broader report. There's also another question raised, which is the appropriateness of comparing a farm's performance to the catchment mean level of nitrogen loss versus the comparison of a farm's performance against a farm system peers in loss. That is, yes, my name's down for that, but I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, sorry. So this is saying that, is it appropriate to compare a farm to the performance against the mean nitrogen loss within the catchment, or should it be done against the peer of the same farming system, the in-loss for a farm system, one of his peers? You know, that's really policy question. I don't think it's mine. Something I can answer from a technical perspective, sorry. Well, this one's a long one, but I would like to see information around the accuracy, the confidence intervals, what peer review has been carried out, and some sensitivity analysis around the assumptions. And so I think within the broader literature, so on the Technical Alliance website, where the documents for Plan Change 1 are presented, within those reports there's extensive sensitivity analysis, and especially within the mitigation report, where there's a structured sensitivity conducted to look at how sensitive the outputs of the model are. But there were also other runs of the model done throughout the process. For example, once we removed constraints based on land use change, what would happen? So I think through that, and this morning I described what peer review has been carried out. There's questions here about the accuracy or the confidence intervals. But this goes for both my modelling and the economic modelling. My model was deterministic, so there was no... so we used point estimates rather than statistical estimates. So there's no information contained therein about the confidence intervals or the accuracy, but we did follow a strong, really the ethic that kind of underlaid the process of model development and application was one of peer review, an external peer review. So we had Bruce McCullough in North America peer review the model. We used standard procedures as well. The modelling framework that we used has been applied probably a dozen times throughout New Zealand, probably more, maybe close to 20 times around New Zealand now. It's been applied internationally as well. And nationally we worked with the industries involved to try and gain the best quality data that we could. So a lot of the processes that we used aligned with best practice, I think. There's one interesting one here. One from Lucy Deverell from HRWO. I think that's around a question for me is the relevance of the economic model to horticulture given the pastoral focus of the model. That's the one I don't understand. Sorry, Lucy, I was just wondering, is there...
I think what Lucy is asking, and sorry, Lucy is not here today.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Sorry about that way.
I think that what I could say is that Lucy's interested to know probably how much information did you have to build the horticultural elements of the model compared to the pastoral elements of the model.
Yes, I think it varied, it definitely varied across industry. So, but it kind of it varied by the scale of the industry as well. So here in Z had, I think, 24 case study farms were used to... 26, sorry. Yep, no, excellent, thank you. Used a high range of farms and dairy support. Was that including dairy support, Matt?
No, excluding.
How many dairy support farms would there be?
What, in the catchment?
No, in terms of model farms or case study farms for dairy support side.
I'm not too sure how the dairy support was modelled.
Yes.
Pretty well as a platform.
Yeah, the platform.
26 farms.
Yes, because I know there was dairy support information as well, and plus beef and lamb were involved with the development of relationship for mixed farm, dry stock farm, sheep and beef farm. We also had, of course, engagement. I think the horticultural data all came from interactions with yourself, Chris, and Stuart, in terms of the data that we did. And so, and I think we had 3 representative farms for that. So it did vary by industry, just based on resourcing, I suppose, and also the incidence of the area of the farm within that district, within that region. So yes, I think that's wise. But I wouldn't say, I don't think we had a pastoral focus within the model. Well, we had a lot more pasture represented than horticulture, but that was because there is a lot more pasture than horticulture on it. Probably right, isn't it? Like if you got out of 1 million hectares, I don't know how much of that is horticulture, but pasture might be different.
I think Lucy's sort of trying to ask the question is, do you see that is there a comparative difference in the farming systems? And that's obviously something which is a difficult one for you to answer in terms of how the model performs, given that it seems to work reasonably clearly for the pastoral systems, but do you think it works as well for the horticultural analysis?
I think my judgment, I think it did. Like, especially under, some of the evaluations, it was, in terms of trying to reach scenario 1 aspirations, for example, we saw quite an enormous impact on horticulture. And, I remember those outcomes were, they were, I think they were realistic. I don't think there was any reason why pasture would perform differently than horticulture would use that information.
I think we did adjust the horticulture coefficients, the nitrogen. I think we documented that because, we're just looking around, wave and stuff like that. There's a lot of nitrogen reserved in the streams around there. We couldn't really, and it's horticulture dominated. Yeah. So I think we did have to run it up in the end and documented that. Just going from memory there. Yeah.
Graham, can I just interject there? Graham Gleeson, Sheep and Beef Farmer.
Yep.
I would dispute that Beef and Lamb were providing that representative farm information back when the model was being put together. As I understood it, Femi, Ian Jamieson, Rex Webby were doing an independent processing, collated some information, but it wasn't from the industry good body that was provided for. So, and I would be questioning the validity of some of those representative farms. I just wanted to raise it just to clarify Beef and Lamb's involvement.
Yeah, and that's something I'm not entirely clear on either, because I know that I think there was, I don't think either of us Graham at that time were involved in that process. I was just wondering, Blair, do you know, Blair, the role of Beef and Lamb within that work when Femi generated that, or I think Femi, but also others generated that? Do you know much about how Beef and Lamb were involved through that process at all?
From my memory, there was a set of data generated and provided to the TLG. It was also presented to the CSG, which generated some questions, and there was a couple of workshops run where any interested parties were along.
All right, I think if I can just cut across this, that's noted. Thank you very much, and your response is noted as well. And your response was don't know, so that's fine.
Yes, and it is written down as well. There's a report on the Technical Alliance website which describes how that data was generated. So I think, I know that there was involvement from the industry good organisation, but I don't know how strong that was. And I think Graham's point is correct, is that it wasn't led by the industry good organisation, even though one or two of the people contributing to it may have had past industry affiliation.
I'd like to quickly summarise, if you like, Graham.
Yes.
Beef and Lamb were invited to be part of the joint venture economic work. They declined to be part of that, and therefore the council took on the modelling for the sheep beef industry.
Yep, that's excellent. No, thank you very much, Matt. Yes, so that answers our question, I hope. Yeah. So the next question was the contribution to the overall 10% reduction. What contribution to the overall 10% reduction does each mitigation factor in the policy mix provide? So according to the Section 32 analysis, the 75th percentile is estimated to contribute around 5% of the total nitrogen decrease, which is However, there is no assessment for the other mitigation activities such as farm environment plans. So I think that is, there's a problem of misunderstanding here, saying according to the Section 32 analysis, the 75th percentile is estimated to contribute approximately 5% of the total N. It doesn't. It represents 5% of the total, between 4 and 5% of the total nitrogen coming from dairy farms, so not of the total N within the catchment. It's scaled by, it's scaled spatially, given that dairy farms don't occur right across every part of the catchment, every hectare. In terms of the contribution of each individual mitigation, that wasn't evaluated as part of that report. We evaluated them collectively but not individually within that. There's a real nice one. Bridget Robson. Bridget here. Yes, hi Bridget. Yeah, that's a nice long one. I don't know.
It's not really a question. It was, I was trying to understand how this process works today and tomorrow as to how you would express a desire to be involved in the expert conferencing.
Yes.
So it was an endeavour to critique the models and how they interacted with policy,
yes,
to demonstrate that expert policy assessment should be part of this ongoing caucusing. So it wasn't really...
Which I think it is, isn't it?
Well, I'm not clear.
Yes. I think that they're going to talk about that afterwards, actually, and I think tomorrow is down for expert caucusing, isn't it?
But who's
about
invited
scoping
and
that.
why or all of the rest of it, I'm still not clear.
Yeah. No, yeah,
So
but that's...
mine is not actually a question round, so it's really a commentary to explain why we wish to continue to be involved.
Yeah, around nitrogen. Yeah, because my one, it seems to be very much focused on within the model that the dairy farm modelling output that we were using from Dairy and Z is associated, here's our view is that the nature of economic modelling means that unevenly overstates the economic effect of the initial 10% reduction, particularly for nitrogen leaching from land use from dairy production. Model outputs understate the reductions that many in the sector could readily achieve. The effect is to divert responsibility for reducing the load to other sectors whose contribution to the leaching problem is minor. And so really the focus of the question is around how the cost of abatement in dairy farms has been overstated within the model. And
Graham, I think we can move on. I think the point made that it is a statement of position is something we can take forward tomorrow.
Yes, yes. But I'd just like to highlight there that the cost to the dairy industry was 2% in that policy mix, which I showed earlier, which is 2%, which strikes me as not very significant cost. And as others here will say that is actually understated, so that's an interesting one to discuss further. And that actually finishes up.
No, it doesn't.
But I'm happy to answer more, of course, yeah.
You may need to just take some of these with you. I think I've highlighted in yellow. If you just randomly discuss those ones.
Yes. You see, this is a really good question. How can the model outputs be used to inform the farm environment planning preparation process and assist farmers make good on-farm decisions regarding mitigation options? We were talking before about models. We have resources available to build a model, and models are built for certain purposes. You construct them for certain things. Within this process, the model was constructed to evaluate catchment level outcomes. So we were modelling at a very high scale, and those outputs were taken to feed into models which looked at the district and regional and national impacts of these policies, so outside of the Waikato catchment and within, but beyond the farm gate. And so this model, a model of this kind can be used to show, especially because it integrates the hydrological models built by NIWA, what it allows us to do is help us try and see, try and highlight the catchments where we can target sediment rather than E. coli or E. coli or nitrogen rather than phosphorus, can help us think about relationships. So if we target this area, how does that flow throughout the other catchments? For example, if we mitigate a kilogram of nitrogen in the top of the catchment, that doesn't flow down the whole stream. That doesn't flow down the whole catchment. And so, really, I think that the model is useful for what it was constructed for, which is the evaluation of different policy outcomes or different scenarios related to water quality. However, in terms of farm level decision making, there are better tools, not like one-on-one discussions with land management staff and farm consultants, and the use of models like mitigator or overseer would be preferable to use, because really we're talking about on farm here, but also with the industry good bodies as well, such as Beef Land and Dairy NZ. There's a lot of expertise there as well through both staff and resources, which help to guide how can we achieve better outcomes on the land.
Graham, just adding to that question about that's about using it on farm. But I see out of this whole process with Healthy Rivers PC1, they're going to want to use this modelling for the council to come up with regulations. So how do you feel this modelling is going to be able to, or how do you feel that the regulators are going to be able to use this modelling?
I'm going to rule that question out. That's driving into policy matters that aren't really the domain of Graham.
Yes, the next question is, given the very long time frame and level of uncertainty about the model outputs and future drivers, why not adapt an adaptive management approach to improving water quality? I think that's a really good question, but there's two parts of it. There's first of all, I think it is adaptive management. We are plan change one. There's no plan change one. It's not going to be plan change one forever. There's a regulatory time frame around this plan change. It's not going to be in train for the next 80 years. There will be a subsequent round of updating, I think, but others can comment on that. But also, the other reason sometimes we can say adaptive management and then do nothing. I think we have to be serious about improving water quality, and I think that's we don't want to be in that case where we say we're going to do adaptive management and then not actually do anything. So I think this is...
Graham, can I give you some more? So you rattle through, you've got heaps of these and you've got 10 minutes. So, I think they're no, yes, yes, or some combination of those.
Did the optimisation result in a change in land use, and if so, what changed where? That changes in land use were permissible within the optimisation model. We did find, really the whole of the Healthy Rivers work was around the 4 contaminants, and so depending on where those targets were set, it made sense to de-intensify some land by having land use change. And of course, it's difficult in a mathematical framework to describe the distortion that happens. like land use change is not a simple process. In a mathematical model, it happens quite easily, but in reality, it's actually a difficult process. Of course, and so really, there's the details within our modelling reports. Land use change shows up a lot in our detailed modelling reports. We comment on that quite extensively. We see a lot of the outputs, and so I would recommend that in terms of the specifics. Does the scenario model have the capacity to include alternative policies and rules? Yes, it does. A lot of flexibility, actually. That's what it was built for. Does it include impacts from the introduction of farm environment plans? The question's a little bit broad, but what we're saying is that we did model, we tried to identify what a farm environment plan would constitute in terms of improvements in reductions of contaminant load, and so we did perform those within the model. There is scope within the model to change those assumptions around how farm environment plans would work on a cost basis, but also an effectiveness basis. Thank you. What confidence do the modellers have in the estimates provided by Overseer for application for regional and sub-catchment modelling? I think everybody's experience in the room there's a lot of old heads in the room, and I think there's no doubt, overseer of the model, and just like any model, there are uncertainties and confidence intervals around the predictions. We used it because it was the leading standard. It's probably the most widely used tool to estimate nitrogen loss in New Zealand. There are other models such as APSIM and SPASMO, which can provide estimates of nitrogen loss for different types of enterprises, from horticultural right through to agricultural. Overseer is more widely used. The industry standard is Overseer, and so we used Overseer based on that. As well, knowing that it wasn't perfect, but no model is perfect, as we highlighted earlier. And there's a question here, model simulation of the CSG policy bundle far exceeds the results far exceed the 10% water quality improvement over 10 years goal of the CSG. What is the breakdown by contaminant? That's in our report, so the report of the policy mix, which assesses the policy mix, that provides quite detailed insight into which contaminant improved relative to others as a result of the policy mix. What you'll find is that a lot of the results were very positive for, I think, E. coli and clarity were improved by more than nitrogen and phosphorus, I believe. Yes, thank you. David? How accurate is the model output? I think, once again, quite difficult to say that, given that it's not a statistical model, it's a deterministic model. There will be some range of error, like even we talk about Overseer with 20% or 30% error margin around its output. We're trying to represent over 1 million hectares of catchment within a mathematical model. It's complex, it's difficult, but at the same time, that as we move through this process, it'll be an opportunity for other parties to present alternative evidence, and that yardstick accuracy becomes, relative accuracy becomes really important, I think. And so, like we did, it's not accurate to 5 decimal places, but I think, you can't be given the scale of what we're dealing with and the dynamic systems we're dealing with. Can the model be used to model in the future? Yes, it can. Yeah, it can be applied further, and I think there are plans to do so. Another one is that economic modelling suggests a 4% productivity cost delivers the first 10% of water quality improvement. Do further 10% gains cost more or less to achieve? Has the model been used to ask this? Yes, the second report, I think it's known as the second scenario. On the Technical Alliance website of the reports, there's one called the evaluation of the second set of scenarios that was put forward by the collaborative stakeholder group. We studied 10%, 25%, 50%, 75% and 100%, which was all of directions or directions of movement towards the scenario 1 outcome that was studied in the first report. And what that showed is that the cost would increase. So the question here is that do a further 10% gains, would they cost more than the 4% of the first? So for the first 10% reduction, it's going to cost us about 4% of income. What would happen if we go another 10%? Is that going to cost 4 or more? And I think our evaluation showed that would cost more, but it wasn't. It wasn't formidably high, but it was still higher. Yes, we've got a tissue here as well. Tears on the back, I think. No. Or something's been used to wipe on it. Hopefully not cyanide or something, but anyway, we'll find out anyway in about 2 minutes. Yeah. So how and where have farm catchment mitigation solutions been modelled to demonstrate freshwater management units can be attained? Yes. So where have they been modelled? Yes. So where have the farm and catchment mitigation solutions been modelled to demonstrate how freshwater management units can be attained? I.e., is there a model that connects nutrient loss at a farm level with catchment freshwater management units? And yes, and that's what we've really been focused on. That's what Sandy's work, especially Sandy's work. Within this model, we start at the farm level. We're trying to represent farm level, and then we, from an economic perspective, we then go to groups of farms, then to freshwater management units, and then to the region, and then to the national level. With water quality, if we have an area of farming, if there's a kilogram of nitrogen lost there, for example, it will flow down the flow network with attenuation and loss. But if we had a kilogram of nitrogen right at the top of the catchment, we represent its flow right down the catchment. So yes, a key part of the design of the model, or the design principles of the model, was that we do deal with nutrient mass at the farm level and then track it right through the catchment. Yes, of course.
Just a point of clarification, from the previous question you said the 10% drop was 4% of income. Earlier in the day did you say 4% of profit?
4% of profit, yes. But it depends.
Which is it?
Yes, it depends how you define income and profit, I think. Some people, economists at the catchment level will use them interchangeably. What we mean really there is operating profit in a farming context. But there's also, it's hard because we're also dealing with annualised values from forest as well. And so those reports, those detailed reports which kind of describe the inputs to the model will show the kind of, will describe how we measured those together. But yeah, it's an annual level. Because what's your question? What type of income do you think that should be? I was just wondering, what type of income do you think that should be? Are you confusing? Do you think it's net farm income or net cash income?
I'd be thinking net farm income, but
yeah. Yep, but not operating. Is that operating or?
I'm just interested in what your definition of it is actually.
Yes, no, but if your definition is different, it's interesting to know that. But what we use, within the economics discipline, I think is, especially at this stage, they can be used interchangeably. But once we move down to the farm level, there's very diverse measurements of operating profit and income. Even we find within the dairy sector, there's across multiple organisations there'll be different measures of operating profit, dairy operating profit. So no, happy to discuss that further.
All right, final question here. Graham?
Yes, bye. Thanks.
Oh, that's bypassed the chair. I think I'll look at that question first. Thank you. You address that one. No special pleasing here.
Did the model inform the development of Table 3-11-1 targets, limits, and to what extent? I would have to be shown Table 3-11-1 probably.
That's the main table that shows the water quality units and targets in the plan. That's in the plan.
You've got a number on this one. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think you can actually see, I know whether it's a policy question or not. But
all right, Bryce is going to address the question.
Yes, it might be the easiest way to answer it.
Just a minute, Graham. This one, and there are a number of other questions in here which is seeking the references that you've been talking through today.
Yes.
I wonder whether in actual fact there's a way by which we can actually pull those all together and provide them to everybody rather than have them floating out there for people to search. Steve, is that something that we can do through Mike and yourself? So if we get all the references that have been, all the report references that have been made today, we can get them out on an email or put up on a site or something like that. Okay, and there's questions about the peer reviews as well, and whether the peer reviews can be made available.
Yes.
Just on that, on the Technical Alliance page on the website, there's a summary of all the reports. There's a document that gives summary of all the reports. You click on that, you'll see the list of all the reports.
Yeah, I guess what I'm hearing is people don't want to read the whole list. They sort of want the ones that you referred to today.
Yes, and they're online. They're on their website as well. But I think
I'm sure there are. But if we can distill those, yes, that would be very helpful. Right? Okay.
Good. The general answer there as well is that really there's questions. So how is the economic modelling being used to inform the policy? And really, that's the interconnection between the technical work that the technical leaders group led and performed, and how the CSG utilised that. So it's an overall governance, kind of process issue almost. So, the model was utilised for the CSG, but at the same time, it wasn't an output from the model that Table 3-11-1.
I don't know about everybody else, but I'm very clear on that after today. I hope everybody else is. No?
We tried to talk about it this morning.
Well, you did, but I'm looking at a lot of furrowed brows. Do you want to repeat what you just said so that sort of hopefully goes in?
Yes, so the economic, maybe even looking back at the slides this morning, the technical leaders group sat to the side of the collaborative stakeholder group, and we provided technical advice which was led by them. And so we, in terms of table 3-11-1 coming from our economic model, it wasn't an output. It was there was a separate policy making process to which the economic and hydrological experts, among others, contributed to, but we didn't write the policy. We contributed technical information into the process of policy development.
But just to be clear, the CSG didn't come up with the numbers in the table 3-1.
No.
Oh, we've got who done it now, have we?
No, I was just making sure that everybody knew it wasn't the CSG as well.
You're taking responsibility for the CSG. That's very good.
Yes. I can clarify that, and I'm conscious for answering all the things, so I can clarify that later.
That's good, Graham. Thank you very much. I'm aware that you wanted to be away 10 minutes ago, so thank you for that. If there are any other questions, we'll put those through Bryce, and I've got several here that otherwise would have gone to Graham as well, Michael.
So, David, my understanding of the point before was that people would like almost a reading list, a sequential reading list, which is a subset of that 45 reports on the technical alliance page. So,
just helpful.
We can perhaps put together that reading list for people so they can step through a logical process.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Right. Do we need to draw breath or carry on? Carry on. Carry on. Carry on. My fortitude, right. For us, is it? Where are we going now? Back to the set questions. The set question, the earlier received question. Sorry, you're standing under head off on this.
I think the first one on the list
is you, yes.
That first one I think is probably unaddressed.
Yeah, the first one from Auckland Waikato Fish and Game, there was one question in there, was how were the water quality outcomes that were input into the economic model determined, and what was the process to link these to outcomes sought by the CSG, and the outcomes included within, I think this is the same table, within table 3.11-1. Is that the same table? Yeah. Right. So maybe we could cover that point off in response to that particular question. So just to be clear, and I hope it is clear now, that the water quality outcomes were determined by the CSG. And so they determined what attribute band they would like the river to be in to meet the vision and strategy. We advised on what the actual numeric numbers would be to achieve those outcomes. And one of the simplest ways to look at that is to say, well, vision and strategy says swimmable. And so CSG says, well, we've got to have a process of getting to, we've got to do things to get it to swimmable. What does that mean, technical guys? And that's where we came in and said, well, for swimmable, the national policy statement for freshwater management defines swimmable as this number. And so that was how the water quality outcomes got defined. Right? And please be assured that those water quality outcomes, so they were the outcomes sought by the CSG, which were the same outcomes that were then taken into the economic model. So it is consistent, right? And then table 3.11.1 in the plan, if I've got the right table, is merely a reflection of that discussion. So if the CSG determined that they wanted Swimmable, well, just choose something else, say chlorophyll, in the river to be at a B attribute band, because that would achieve what they were seeking to achieve from a vision and strategy point of view. So that is the number that has been aimed for in the 80-year time frame. And the numbers that are present in the table, if I've got the right table, include what a 10% movement would be from what it currently is to what it's trying to get to. All right? So it's 10% of the difference between what it is and what it's trying to get to. So if you're trying to get to a number 1 and you're currently at a number 2, so you want to drop the concentration of something from 2 to 1, and you want to get 10% of the way there, you want to get it down to 1.9. Okay? So that, hopefully, if you look in that table, that will make sense. Now, there'll be some places where you are already at the goal, the 80-year goal. So the number won't change because you're already there. Okay? And at that site, for that parameter, you don't need to do anything. You've achieved it. Alright? Don't need to do anything in a water quality sense for that site and that parameter. But always remember that water flows downhill. So I hope that explains the table.
Could I ask a question that's related to that around the definition of the current state? Is there a report anywhere that describes the analysis that was done to define the current state?
Yes, and as part of Mike's role on the TLG, I think Mike actually, who was John Quinn, sorry. So John Quinn and Mike reviewed it and was involved in it. So there is a report on
like 5 years ago.
Yeah, so it's got,
yes.
So it used a 5-year data set from the regional council, and I think for one of the parameters it actually uses an extra year, E. coli, I think. Because it
is all captured in the report.
It's all captured in the report.
Look, this is the,
Yeah.
you guys are familiar with this. We're all just thinking, to be honest.
Right. And to define the current state, because you've got variability through time, through seasons, you need a sufficient length of record to get a current state.
Yeah, I'm more interested in what sort of data grooming and that type of thing might happen with that 5 years of data.
Okay. Unfortunately,
but it's in the report.
Should be in the report.
Do we know which report it is?
That'll be on the list, all right? It'll be on the list.
It's that report.
There was, in the written ones, there was a question around, from Gannon around incorporation of Matarana Māori, and I think I've already answered that earlier on. That one's for Sandy. I think you might be able to answer that.
Sorry.
Oh, well, what year was the land use
Can I just go back to the written ones first and we can maybe knock those off on the previous written ones, circulated ones? Yeah, so you guys probably don't have a list, but Lucy Deverell is asking the relationship between freshwater concentrations, freshwater objectives and discharge from the lands in terms of unattenuated loads. So I wasn't entirely clear what, that was a Horton said question, I wasn't entirely clear on what the question was.
I think you answered the question.
Largely covered? Okay. What is the relationship? Yeah, okay. Fine. Policy that, yeah, I think between us it's been addressed to some degree.
A little bit gift horse in the mouth, Sandy. You said you answered it.
Right, yes, so there's another one here. Yeah, so there's another one from Greymont Benjamin Murray. Can the WRC please provide guidance towards the time resolution in which the model will operate? For instance, will the model produce annualised contaminant loads, daily contaminant loads, etc.? I think it's been covered already. Pretty clear that we're only doing the annualised type job with this model. Further down, so I'm just trying to get, there was a further question from the same questioners there, number 7. Are contaminant loads, transformation processes being accounted for in the model, or is the model only representing total contaminant loads? So the short answer is total contaminant loads. We don't break down total phosphorus and total nitrogen into the different species and their interactions. It's not that type of model, we're just doing the totals. I mean, there is some attenuation, so in a way that's it's a process that's occurring, but apart from that, it's not built around the different nutrient species and their interactions and so on. There's other classes of models that do that, but this wasn't one. Let's see, Graham. That may have been my only 3 questions in those pre-circulated list. There is, obviously, there's material that came through from Wairaki Pastoral, presented, I think a lot of those, I mean, they're very good and searching questions that should be addressed at some stage. Most of them seem to me like it's a statement of position, and it's probably stuff that's best addressed, in more detailed caucusing and so on. I'm sure Wairaki Pastoral will be there. So there's probably an opportunity for them to table some of their positions and their concerns, but not really specific questions at this stage. And there was I've lost it. Some other stuff came through from, yes, from, sorry, who's that from?
Waikato Region and Territorial Authorities.
Waikato Region and Territorial Authorities, okay. It's a bit difficult with only having seen this morning. I didn't particularly see anything that was a model in question that I need to address, but okay. There are some. Sorry, yeah. So I'm wondering how we can unbundle that. Perhaps Bryce could fish through those while we try to address some of these other questions. We're playing tag team because I didn't pick that up briefly before.
And this question has been asked several times by different people, so if you cover those off, you might deal with some others.
Okay, so how do the water quality models deal with climate change? Climate change hasn't really been addressed in these models, so it's left as a unattended to question. And yeah, that is a good question. It's something that would be nice to address because there can be effects of temperature changes or rainfall on sediment, phosphorus losses, all those sorts of things which we haven't factored into these calculations. Sandy mentioned further work could be done to improve the nutrient-chlorophyll relationship. And what would this involve? There's different levels at which you might address that question and you work that you might do. it probably would involve dynamic modelling of the processes. Some of that had occurred previously in the, well, actually it wasn't dynamic, but it was some of the transformation processes occurring down the main stem of the Waikato River in the modelling that Kit Rutherford did for the risk process and other work, consents-related work. And so that's one example of that type of model that takes a different species account and the algal growth dynamics as the water moves down through the reservoirs and all those sorts of things, that high and low flows. And we considered that at the outset of this modelling, but thought there wouldn't be sufficient time to do that justice and to refresh that work. So yeah, you could pull that up, or you could be doing the full dynamic modelling, as full coupled biogeochemical modelling. And so exactly which level you'd address it at depends on resources and the degree of accuracy you'd want. But it's something along those lines that I think would be warranted as you go into another phase, or everybody goes into another phase of modelling, stage modelling. Yeah. Does the algal growth model deal with seasonality? No. Okay, so a question from Fish and Game, Anna, is representing some of the science folk. In calculating the Elliott attenuation factors, what spatial database and what year of land use was used in this estimate? Can we get a copy of the shape file? A shape file of current land use, I think that's available. Beyond that, what would you actually be after? Yeah. Yes, and sometimes with the land use maps we do get into difficulties of whether we're at liberty to pass those on to others. We obtained them from the council for this study, so there might have to be something that would be looked at. Council question, yeah, whether they can get that land use. So the question is what spatial database? I don't know what other aspects of spatial data you were imagining in relation to the attenuation factors. There's very close oxic status of groundwaters was one of the factors that was taken into account there. That's readily available. I can't think of anything else immediately. It might be worth just going back and having a look at some of those reports. What leaching rates were assumed for each land use? How was this derived and extrapolated? Yeah, and Graham and I had discussions about whether it's his role to present that information or not, and some of it has been mentioned in passing today, but we didn't really drill down into which specific, what was the different lumping of the different dairy land types and that sort of stuff, and some of it we obtained from the industry separately as part of a separate process. Probably would require some further time to unbundle that and present that more clearly. If it's unclear to people and it's fallen between the cracks there, we could probably have an effort to try and really spell that out for people. Yeah. Gee, there's a lot of questions. Yeah. How was it determined that the water quality standards that the plan aims to achieve give effect to the swimmable, fishable mahinga kai and ecosystem health goals? So it's probably a Bryce type question.
Yeah, I hope I kind of addressed that earlier. So I hope that's understood. And in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, there's three compulsory values around ecosystem health and I've forgotten. Oh yeah, it's not called swimmability though. It's called human health. It's called, and then there's recognition of te mana o te wai. So those were the kind of that's the framework in which everything was worked within during this process. And as I said before, the attribute tables in the National Policy Statement provide guidance on the numbers to be used to meet those values.
Another question that might be able to address that now.
How do attribute values compare to guidelines and standards and other documents? So I think I just described that. Now, just to be clear, that in the NPS there are bands or concentration values that refer to a national bottom line. So that is that the water quality must get above that, and councils and so on need to have plans in place to get above that bottom line. However, the process within a catchment or a region can decide to aim for higher than the bottom line. Okay? And that is indeed what has happened in this process, primarily because there is the vision and strategy to take account of, and that vision and strategy has targets, aspirations above that bottom line. So just to be clear.
So it probably overrides it anyway.
And it overrides it in legislation too. So. Yes, Craig.
Bryce, so I understand the TNT thing, but could you just, what happened with visual clarity? Because there is no NPSFM threshold that's been set at the...
Yes, so there's a couple of I guess water quality attributes that are in this process that were not and still are not in the NPS, but we were required to look at all four. So the person, I'm coming out right this time, the person who drove that process and expert workshopping on it was Mike.
So we brought together a group of water quality experts to go through the list of attributes that are in the NPS, but also the list of attributes much more widely. So things like macrophyte biomass or water clarity or macroinvertebrate community health. And the clarity one was seen as the most important because it links to human health in terms of the vision and strategy saying that it's safe to swim in. And so we used, because the NPS didn't give those A, B, C, D bands for clarity, we based those bands on work NIWA had done back in the early 90s. Some work Rob Davies' colleagues and others had done on a national survey of what people considered as suitable for swimming. And so that was the bottom line for that became the 1 metre of clarity is deemed as minimal suitability for swimming. Thank you.
And I think that answers one of the questions that Fish and Game had as well.
So we certainly looked at fisheries, particularly the macroinvertebrate community index, which many of you will be aware has been a very much a live conversation about whether that should be part of the NPS or not. At the time we ran that process, it was very clear, I guess, national or central government direction that MCI couldn't necessarily be used as an attribute. And also because a lot of our outcomes were in the main stem of the river, as opposed to wadeable streams where you tend to measure these macroinvertebrates, we didn't end up going for a macroinvertebrate attribute.
I think you should handle the mic.
So that's number 3. How was the low meter clarity outcome determined with fisheries and health outcomes considered. No, for the 1 metre clarity, it was solely to do with suitability for contact recreation. Richard?
Mike, while you're there, I had a question about, very related to that. I'm interested, given that temperature and dissolved oxygen are at the national level given limits, and given that they are fundamental to measuring ecosystem health, I'm curious as to why they didn't make the cut for the analysis.
Yeah, so they were put forward to CSG as potential attributes. Maybe Bryce can talk about that, but there were a whole range of attributes that the Technical Alliance and then through the TLG were recommended to CSG, but there were a lot of conversations around scope, linked to the 4 contaminants and the ability to manage outcomes for those 4 contaminants, which I think at the end of the day limited the scope of those attributes.
You don't mean project scope in terms of cost, you mean?
No, so the scope of the plan change was around nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment and E. coli. Right. So questions about temperature and dissolved oxygen were hotly discussed, or were discussed by the CSG, but at the end of the day they determined it was out of scope.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I guess there's a whole range of other things like arsenic and carbon that weren't included either. That affect ecosystem health and human health. It's about the scope of the plan change. Thanks, Mike. And the final question on this page was, has any science been done around wetland attributes and outcomes required to achieve ecosystem health in wetlands, and specifically the Whangamarino wetland and Lower Waikato estuary? In terms of the process, there was discussion around CSG and also with the technical experts around whether an attribute set could be developed related to these 4 contaminants, just remember that, or not. And the conclusion was it could not, because the science wasn't there. The conclusion was that the requirement to have no further decline in water quality and to start to improve, so all of the streams feeding into the Whangamarino, for example, are captured by that, if you like, that would at least do something. But what the something was, the science wasn't there to be able to say.
Territorial authority. So there were a few in here, there were a couple, you said before, yeah, there was some territorial authority questions. I'm not sure which ones, but it's not the Waikato region territorial authorities. There's a section in there that says questions specifically related to scientific and economic modelling. The first question was about municipal wastewater treatment plant upgrades, and an associated question is how do those assumptions relate to the 2013 Opus report? And even a further one about wastewater treatment plants, again, is what are the assumptions about zones of reasonable mixing for point source municipal wastewater treatment plants and achieving water quality targets. So I can answer that one about the mixing zones. Basically, we didn't do a small spatial analysis or small scale spatial analysis of plumes or mixing zones and that sort of stuff for the wastewater treatment plants. We really looked at the impact of the wastewater treatment plants on the closest downstream regular monitoring station, so the environment monitoring station. So it wasn't really a mixing zone analysis, so to speak. And question 5 just says, it's the first one. So as to where the reductions associated with the wastewater treatment plants came from and whether they were OPIS numbers and those costs, I don't actually know. It might be a Graham question. I don't know if the TLG people know where those where those point source mitigation numbers came from, both in terms of cost and effectiveness.
I think that work was done, and I think Blair Tennant from the Regional Council had an involvement in pulling that work together. So I don't know whether Blair, you've got any comment to make in relation to that question?
Just to say, as far as I know, the point source numbers did come from the OPIS report. We certainly passed it over. I assume that they were the ones that we used.
And there was a peer review of that report conducted as well, which in general highlighted its value and pointed out a few wrinkles.
And the remainder of those questions are actually economic questions, I think. Does the model include any assumptions regarding offset mitigation to give effect to policy 11? And if it does, what are the assumptions and what reports support those assumptions? There's a bit out of my league about offset mitigation in policy 11.
Yeah, it's out of our league in terms of we weren't asked to model any of that. So we didn't do it.
And the final, well, actually not quite the final section, but there's another one about transaction costs, assumptions regarding transaction costs, and I'm afraid Graham might be the only one who can actually answer that question. It's the economic question, how much it costs to manage things and so on. I suspect it wasn't taken into account for his model, maybe in some of the board economic modelling there might have been. And the question 7 there, what degree of confidence do the modellers have that the assumptions and methodologies included with respect to mitigation measures included in the model will achieve the water quality targets? Gee. Well, one thing Graham said, he took a single number and didn't do uncertainty analysis. Ideally, one would do an uncertainty analysis and would have a range about all those ranges about the mitigation cost and performance and that sort of stuff, but he didn't do that analysis. As to how confident he is about, or we are about the single value that was used, I think it was probably done on as well as we could do with existing information based on reviews and expert opinion and documentation of that. But sometimes there just isn't a whole lot of data about those things from specific studies. So there's remaining uncertainty. It actually quantifying that uncertainty is pretty tricky. Yeah. Medium confidence. So that's about all I have from that list.
There's a few questions here that I think, in the interest of time, I think we've kind of answered them. And I think we've answered them rather than reading out again and
Just note that all these questions will come forward into tomorrow's session in any event to make sure that we've covered off the issues as we need to. So just because you don't hear your question doesn't mean we haven't taken any notice of it.
I think that one there is one that you could have a crack at, Cindy.
How was the attenuation determined per sub-catchment? What is the margin of error? It depends on which model. If we're talking about the E. coli model, the sediment model, E. coli model was determined by calibration it's a function of travel time of water within the sub-catchment calibrated to measurements. So that was a calibration exercise. For phosphorus, it was attenuation coefficient from another model called CLUES, but we rescaled it because too much attenuation was occurring compared to the measurements. So there's sort of a mixture on that one. There was the reservoir attenuation based on, or the starting point was based on effective settling rates and the flow rates through the reservoir effectively. For nitrogen, it's a complex story, and I started to get into that question. Generally speaking, it was determined by trying to, on a sub-catchment basis, match the measured loading with, to match the loading that you get after attenuation from the model with the actual measurements. But that's all tempered by, well, some catchments didn't have very good measurements, and we lumped catchments together, and then there's the load to come question. So there's actually, it's a really complicated situation for the nitrogen attenuation within the sub-catchment.
And the next question, which I'll just read it out, but I think we've probably dealt with it. How was the 80-year water quality outcomes determined, and were variations to these considered? So I think I've explained how they were determined, meeting vision and strategy, and CSG discussing what that meant. And were variations to these considered? Yes, they were, and I think Graham explained that in his scenario modelling presentation, where in the first instance the CSG asked for a number of scenarios to be looked at that were less than the scenario one, and also in the second round of modelling they asked for a series of scenarios that looked at steps along the way to that scenario one. So yes, variations were considered.
Yeah,
there's a whole lot here.
Yeah, I mean, there are more questions. I shouldn't say there are more questions than answers, of course, there are more answers than questions, but there are a lot more questions as well, so we're not going to get through them, so let's not pretend. We've got a quarter of an hour now, just to discuss tomorrow, I guess. Or, well, before we discuss tomorrow, any questions that you have of us in terms of the process? Yeah.
Nor are they available on 10th or 11th, and I'm just inquiring whether observers can go along tomorrow and take
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. Yes, I mean, I think for those parties whose experts are unable to actually be here tomorrow, and the same thing I think on the 10th and 11th, obviously it would be quite appropriate for observers to attend. They will attend not as speaking parties. We will run a what is known colloquially as the Simon Circle process going forward, which is that we'll have an inner circle of experts who may have observers sitting around on the outside, if you like, who can communicate with their expert but not actually be involved in the conversation, because it is an expert conference and not a public forum. So yes, if you do in actual fact want to have observer status, just let Steve know, and let Steve know who your observer will be, so that we're aware of that. We are aware, of course, there are some fairly significant conferences and other things going on the 10th and 11th of December. We did look to see whether in actual fact it was possible to change those dates. I'm afraid some of us are just too committed to be able to do that, so those dates will stand. As I foreshadowed in the beginning, I think what we will be requiring of parties, of their experts, whether they attend or cannot attend, is to provide a will say statement in advance, which gives an indication, or what I prefer to call a may say statement, because of course they may change their views. So that if you like, the areas of concern are canvassed in sufficient detail that we can ensure that the expert conference takes those matters on board. They will then obviously be party also to any sort of draft statements or whatever come out of that, so there's an opportunity to engage with that process. We're then anticipating, we haven't confirmed it, we're anticipating we'll have a second round on the 30th and 31st of January, again, to finalise matters. Don't have the dates yet, I think, Stuart, for the final dates for evidence and exchange, but understand that's to be in late February, I think, the latest I heard, for this particular block. I may be wrong there. Does anybody have that? Anybody know those dates? No, I'm pretty sure that it was something like the 24th or something. Yeah, Steve's nodding at the back, so that must be somewhat appropriate. Either he's gone to sleep, I'm not sure which. Chris?
Do we have any idea about when planning caucusing and things like that might take place?
No.
Okay.
In a nutshell. I guess those timelines haven't quite been sorted yet. I understood that there was that the hearing panel was getting fairly close to establishing those sort of timelines, but obviously they're not out yet. So certainly, as I apologize to those whose experts can't attend, but we will involve them, and I think that's the critical point. I mean, the whole point of this process is to try and identify and narrow the issues, and if possible resolve, but that may not be possible. But certainly we want full participation as much as we can, and whether that be in person or by proxy or whatever, we'll look to accommodate that. Yes, sorry, there's two hands. All right, yes, sir, you got up first. Sorry.
Oh, good. I'm making assumptions here. Look, the vast majority of submitters are small end and are not supported by experts. This process tends to alienate all of those submitters. How do you actually accommodate their issues within this process?
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess a number of different ways of answering that question. The first answer clearly is that this is an expert conference. Routine, if you like, that we've been engaged to run, so that's part of the answer. Obviously this forum is part of what we're running, but we're not part of the hearing panel, so the hearing panel will have its own process, and council presumably has its own process as well. I can't offer you any succour in terms of opening the process up to non-experts, because, as I say, that's what this part of the process is. It's really trying to drive the, if you like, the facts behind the policy, and not the policy itself, and that's one of the reasons why we're not getting into the policy. If we can actually get agreement on the science and the modelling and so on and so forth, then that's obviously going to assist everyone else. So yeah, can't give you any comfort, I'm afraid, from from the point of view of our role. You'll need to take that up with the hearing panel in due course.
There is a large factual base not being accessed.
Recognise that, yeah. And I mean, the turnout today is a demonstration. I mean, there's a multiplier effect that goes from a group like this. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Just following on from my earlier question, it wasn't quite clear to me from the description of what today was, of how the people who would be involved tomorrow were being chosen or constrained or whatever else it was.
Yeah.
And from the sounds of what you've just said now, it's science, economics and presumably farm systems, because that fed also into economics, but not policy. Is that the case?
Absolutely is the case, yes. I mean, a number of parties have asked for their planners, for example, to be present, and we're quite relaxed about that, but they will not be in the inner circle, they'll be in the outer circle. In terms of how to get through the gate, Steve's the gatekeeper at this point in time, and he has a list of, as I understand it, Steve, that you have a list of people who've indicated that they consider themselves to be experts and want to attend tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah, and anyone else who actually thinks they should be included in that process, please, just talk to Steve, put your name forward. We're suggesting that that those who are coming tomorrow try to be here by 8:30, so we can actually have a bit of a drafting gate session, if you like, to see who qualifies. We'll parade you in front of us and decide whether we like you or not, and then you'll go through one gate or another. Yes. The analogies yes, get a bit everywhere. But no, we obviously need to make a call because of the fact that we have been engaged to run an expert process. So we do need to establish, if you like, credentials for direct participation in the matters that we're actually going to be addressing. Yes.
David, can we outline those matters we're going to be addressing? Because I'm a bit confused. So it's purely science and purely modelling.
Basically, there's the economic model and the inputs to the model. Yes, that's what this process is. That's the brief we've been given.
Yeah. David, I think one of the things you mentioned this morning is that it's about highlighting what the questions and issues are rather than necessarily resolving them tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow certainly is a scoping exercise to actually establish what the expert conferencing is going to be about. So trying to drill down to those matters that really do need to be conferenced on, as opposed to matters that don't make a lot of difference to the outcome, basically. So we're trying to actually narrow those matters down. So a lot of the questions that you've given us today obviously form the backbone of some of those matters that need to be taken further. You know, what will come out of tomorrow, I've got no idea, can't hazard a guess at that point, but almost certainly there will be further work that will be required, and there will be certainly further corpusing that will be required, which won't end in January. I'm quite confident about that. Some of that stuff will, as you've highlighted, they will go further. Yeah.
David, I won't be there tomorrow. I'm not an expert. I'm just a farmer. I had 5 questions which went forward, none of which have been drawn out of the hat. So how do I actually get an answer on those questions?
Those questions, which we'll review over, and obviously we'll put those on the table tomorrow for people to decide whether those are matters that go to the nub of the issue or don't go to the nub of the issue. They might not satisfy you, but that's how.
So potentially I won't get an answer if they don't go to the nub of the issue. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. But you obviously are confident that they will go to the nub of the issue, so you shouldn't be so concerned, should you?
I'm just looking for an answer.
That's not a great answer.
Well, you may not get an answer. I mean, I'm being quite candid about that. I mean, as I say, the object tomorrow is to actually determine what matters need to be caucused on with respect to science, economics, and modelling. Now, I don't know whether your questions went to the nub of those or not. The fact that they weren't discussed today doesn't mean they didn't. As I say, there's a sheaf of questions there that weren't actually answered.
David, in terms of today's exercise, were we recording the answers to the questions, and is there a process around questions that couldn't be answered today that was potentially able to be addressed in writing
I'm reluctant to set homework to answer the questions that haven't been answered. Yes, I think there are numbers over the back here. I think it's been up for a while. Yes,
Will the outcome of tomorrow be made available for those of us that don't make the cut?
We actually haven't talked about what that outcome might look like, Stuart. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't be if we've got an outcome.
But like today's being recorded.
Yeah. No, I understand the question. We just haven't got to the end of the point yet. But certainly, in terms of if we achieve what we hope we'll achieve, then we will have a set of issues and questions and so on and so forth that are to be caucused further on. So there's absolutely no reason why that should not be available. I just haven't thought how that might be. That's all.
I was meaning more like minutes of tomorrow, like the recording.
Well, no, there won't be minutes. There'll be an outcome, and we'll just have to see what that outcome is. That ought to be available. But in terms of tomorrow's session, I'll be running it on Chatham House rules, which is basically no attribution of where people come from and so on. We're just talking about the issues, not where they come from. Yep.
So just a matter of clarification about procedures tomorrow. One of the instructions that came through by email was that we were to draw up a statement around any alternative modelling, etc. And that's what's being considered tomorrow in terms of what will then be discussed on the 10th of November. So we've drawn up that statement. We haven't submitted it as questions in this session that's just been.
Right.
So I just wanted to be clear on how our alternative modelling and our questions actually get considered tomorrow.
You haven't submitted to anybody? I suggest you...
We brought it.
Oh, right, well, just...
Bring it.
Yes, okay. I'll just hand those over to Steve and they'll come forward for tomorrow's session. Yeah. But are you having someone participating tomorrow? Yeah, okay. That's fine. Well, they can...
We're just trying to ensure that we don't miss out, but there's been quite a bit of confusion in the instructions.
Yes. Yeah, accept that. Yes.
I think overseer should be included in your science. I'm wondering whether you consider overseer as a model to be considered.
I'm looking sideways.
Or whether overseer itself, what I got from the question is whether overseer itself should be a part of the conferencing and considered as a model that is subject to examination, conferencing and so on.
Part of the conversation.
We can state how we've used overseer and what level and all that sort of stuff. As Graham was saying, well, we kind of take overseer as a standard and don't necessarily question it all that much. But you're saying you'd like to take a step further and so I think that should probably be raised tomorrow, shouldn't it?
We're just checking. Steve has a suspicion that overseer specifically is a matter for a different block of considerations, and he's just checking to see whether that is the case or not. If it is, then obviously we would only discuss it to the extent that we need to. There's a hand up, yes?
Yeah, just a couple of questions. Has there been communication about all the different blocks of these sessions? Because I feel that I'm probably at the wrong session.
Well, have you been in communication? I know what block I'm in. Short answer no. Short answer no. I mean, we're just dealing with this issue which we've been briefed to do. So.
Secondly, obviously tomorrow is a precursor to some expert conferencing, so it's scoping the conferencing. And is it just the submitters experts that are going to be there, or are these technical people that we've heard from today going to be there, or are there separate regional council people that are contributing to the 42A report?
No.
Are they going to be there?
Oh, well, there's a number of questions in there. As far as I'm aware, tomorrow we've certainly got these. We've got our panel there and submitter experts. So all the parties who are involved,
including the chap that went home.
Yep.
Before.
I was just add while David's talking on the side, I think it's probably useful just to confirm that in terms of the expectations out of this process, there will be a facilitated report. There will be a report from David and I, which will set out the issues considered, where agreement has been reached, where agreement hasn't been reached, and the reasons for that non-agreement. So that I'm just wanting to confirm with you all that that's the output that will come from this process and which will be available to everyone. And we're expecting that to be in early February at this stage.
Just on that overseer question, I understand that it is in Block 1, but it's not part of the Science and Economic Conference. So I'm not quite sure. That's as I understand it.
Just an issue of scope, and I was wondering what science modelling was. I now realise today it referred to water quality modelling. So I'd like to see this referred to water quality modelling. Okay. And the reason I raise it is a whole range of models and modelling approaches, and one of them is integrated assessment, which is a socio-economic modelling activity. It kind of sits within the economic domain, and I'm kind of hoping that might be drawn into some of the ongoing discussions in this
because that has a big impact on rural communities, etc. So just a point of scope, maybe tomorrow that we can think about the integrated assessment work as well.
And I think the thing that hangs off that is the concept of you might be an expert relating to integrated assessment modelling.
Yeah. Yes.
And how long is a piece of string?
Yeah, thanks, Marlene. I know where you're going. Yeah. That's why I'm trying to narrow it down. Yes.
Well, that's leading to a level of frustration, I suspect,
Recognise that.
and nervousness.
Yes.
Just a point in relation to process. Today's been really helpful having three experts go through methods. One thing that's come out of the presentations today has been the key documents on which the experts have relied. They're clearly right across those, got those references at the fingertips. We can't expect to have a list or a bibliography from each of the three of them by tomorrow. But it would be really useful to have a bibliography of what we've actually relied on in the presentations today, so the detailed reports that we've relied on. I don't think we've put the will-say statements in, because I think the other experts need to understand what those key reports are that they looked at, rather than just being referred to the website with sort of whole draft of other reports which are key ones that have been relied by the experts.
Thanks, Trevor. Yes. Bryce, I guess that's for you to respond. I mean, my expectation would be that they will all respond and say that all of those reports are important, but that's
to a degree, but I think one of the things we could have done today probably is at the bottom of each slide we could have had the report from which it was drawn, which would have answered your question straight off, and the report and the page number even. So perhaps that could be an addition to the actual presentation to do that.
It's that level of detail.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing you say, Tracy, you want it sooner rather than later, because the 10th of December is coming up fairly quickly, and if we have the will says before then, and then before then, so I just wonder whether in the next 24 hours we can actually get that bibliography together, basically. Because I think I only heard probably about 8 or 9 reports actually being referred to, so I don't think it's an extensive list, so it shouldn't be difficult to get that. We'll work on that. Yeah. Any other? Well, you're extraordinarily well behaved. Commend you. Frustrations or not, Marlene. Yes. Right. Well, what do we do now? But just before you do, as I say, if those of you who are or those experts, and I'll put quotes around that for a second, who wish to attend tomorrow, or you can let them know, can be here at 8:30, so we can just make sure that we've got the right people in the right spaces, basically. And by that time, we also will have decided how we're going to run tomorrow, because we've got to think about now how we actually run that. Yes.
Hi, David. I've got another question about the scope, and it just it's part of the uncertainty about not knowing what the other topics are going to be going forward through the hearing process and the end. I totally understand that the science modelling is not to include policy. However, when we talk about modelling, we are including questions about assumptions and about the decisions that go into the model, so that could be considered policy. So it's a very grey area. So my concern is that we have had a directive from the Hearings Commissioners stating that anything to do with the modelling, we have to raise it here. If we don't raise it here, we're not allowed to raise it in any other forum. So my concern is that if you narrow the scope of these discussions to exclude some of those questions around assumptions and policy input to the modelling, we lose our opportunity forever. So I'd like to have some kind of answer on record to ensure that we don't.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess we may be talking policy in a slightly different, cross purposes here. I mean, yes, there's a sense in which assumptions are policy based, I think when I've been using the word today, what I'm meaning is we're not going to be looking at the specific policies that are in PC1. That's really what I'm talking about. So we're not going to be looking at policy 1 and 3 and how the model influenced or was influenced by that. That's for a different thing.
So it does include CSG decisions, because the way Graham was speaking earlier, he was excluding that kind of thing, saying, oh, that's policy, that's not science.
Well, we may have to take that on the particular tomorrow and just do it on a the matter gets raised, then let's make a ruling on it and decide which way it falls in terms of that issue. I mean, I accept that there are, well, I mean, obviously everything we're talking about has policy implications, and it is a bit artificial making that distinction. So what I'm talking about is that we're not going to discuss specific policies in PC1. That's really what I'm talking about. And that might get us into problems, but there'll be people around the table who will then tell us what the problem is, and we'll work it through. Can't be very definite, I'm afraid. There's an element of trust me in this process, obviously. In the same way that we have to trust you to bring the issues to the table. So, all right, see you in the morning. Bye.